There is a place in the North Atlantic where the water is so cold and so dark and so deep that the men who fell into it rarely had more than a few minutes before the sea made its final claim. No headlines reached those waters. No crowds gathered on distant shores to mark the moment. There was only the ocean, indifferent, enormous, and absolute, and the men caught inside it, wondering how it had all come to this. This is a story about one of those men, not the ones who drowned, though they are here too, and their weight is felt on every page of this history. This is the story of the man who sent them there, a man who was, by every professional measure, extraordinarily good at his work. A man who climbed inside a steel cylinder, barely wider than a city bus, sealed the hatch behind him, and descended into the dark to hunt. His name was Reinhard Suhren. Most people have never heard of him. That is, in its own way, part of the story. The Second World War produced its legends in the predictable places: the bombers over London, the beaches of Normandy, the frozen rubble of Stalingrad. But there was another war being fought in the spaces between. A war with no fixed front lines, no visible terrain, no stable geography at all. It was fought in fog and in silence. It was fought in water pressure and failing oxygen and the terrible arithmetic of torpedoes. It was fought by men who knew, with a clarity that most soldiers never face, that if they lost on any given day, the ocean would swallow the evidence and move on without them. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of the entire war. It stretched from the first week of September 1939 all the way to the final hours of May 1945. Nearly 6 years of unbroken naval conflict across millions of square kilometers of open sea. On one side, the convoys, hundreds of merchant ships carrying food, fuel, weapons, and men from the factories of North America to the battered ports of Britain. On the other, the U-boats, a fleet of German submarines whose commanders had been given one cold strategic objective: cut the supply line, starve the island, win the war before it could be resupplied into infinity. At its peak, this campaign consumed more tonnage, more lives, and more strategic anxiety than almost any other theater of the war. Winston Churchill would later write that the U-boat threat was the one thing that truly frightened him throughout the conflict. Not the Blitz, not the fall of France, the submarines. Reinhard Suhren was one of those submarines. Or rather, he was the mind that directed one. And in the world of the U-boat arm, the mind of a commander was everything. A submarine is not a weapon in the way a rifle is a weapon. It is a system, mechanical, human, psychological, that depends entirely on the judgment of one man standing at the center of it all. The captain decides when to dive and when to surface, when to attack and when to run, when to trust the numbers and when to trust his instincts. Get it right and you come home. Get it wrong and you don't. The mathematics are that simple and that brutal. Suhren got it right more often than almost anyone. He grew up in the industrial Ruhr Valley, in a Germany that had been broken open by defeat, stripped of its pride and most of its navy by the Treaty of Versailles, and left to find its way through years of economic collapse so severe that ordinary families burned currency notes for warmth, because the paper was worth more as fuel than as money. He was a child of that chaos. He entered the Kriegsmarine in the early 1930s as a young man looking for structure, purpose, and the particular kind of identity that military life offers to people who feel unmoored by the world around them. He was not unusual in that his generation was full of young men making the same calculation. What made Suhren unusual was what happened next. When Germany's secretly rebuilt U-boat fleet began expanding and seeking volunteers, he raised his hand, Submarine service in those years was not glamorous. It was considered strange, claustrophobic, slightly mad, the kind of duty that attracted men who were either genuinely gifted or quietly desperate for something to prove. Suhren was the former. He took to the work with the focused intensity of someone who had found, perhaps for the first time, the exact right fit between a man and his profession. By the time the war reached its terrible momentum, he was commanding his own boat. By the time Germany's U-boat campaign reached its bloodiest peak, he was one of the most effective submarine captains in the Atlantic. His crew trusted him with the specific bone-deep loyalty that only forms between people who have shared extreme danger and come out the other side intact. The officers under his command would speak of him, years later, with the kind of careful reverence that doesn't come from official honors. It comes from the memory of a man who kept you alive when the depth charges were falling and the hull was groaning and every rational thought was telling you it was over. But here is the thing that this documentary will not let you look away from. Every ship that Reinhard Suhren sank had people on it. Every torpedo that found its mark meant men in freezing water, men in burning oil, men with families in ports they would never reach. His effectiveness as a commander was not an abstraction. It was measured in human lives, on both sides of the equation. The sailors who served beneath him paid in exhaustion and fear and permanent psychological damage. The sailors who sailed against him paid in something far worse. History owes both groups something more than a footnote. That is what we are here to explore tonight. Not a celebration, not a condemnation. Something harder and more honest than either. The full shape of a man's life, set against the full shape of a war that consumed tens of millions of human beings and left the survivors to make sense of it for decades afterward. Suhren's story asks questions that have no clean answers, about capability and complicity, about what it means to be good at something terrible, about how nations create the conditions for men like him to exist, and then what they do with those men once the shooting stops. We will follow him from his boyhood in the Ruhr to his first glimpse of the sea, from the training academies to the torpedo rooms, from his early patrols to the peak of his command, from the turning of the tide to the moment the ocean finally refused to give him back. If you are settling in for the night, if this is the voice that will carry you towards sleep, then let it carry you somewhere real. The Atlantic is still out there, the wrecks are still on the bottom, and the history, if you listen closely enough, still has things it wants to say. Stay with us. This is the complete story of Reinhard Suhren, the ace of U-564. The Ruhr Valley does not whisper, it roars. In the early years of the 20th century, the region that stretches across the western belly of Germany was a place of perpetual industrial thunder, blast furnaces burning through the night, coal dust settling on windowsills, and the rhythmic hammering of steel mills that never truly fell silent. This was a landscape built not from beauty, but from purpose, a place where the ground itself had been excavated, processed, and transformed into the industrial muscle of an empire. The men who lived there carried that quality with them, a bluntness, a resilience, a refusal to accept what could not be named or measured. Into this world, in 1915, Reinhard Suhren was born. The war that had already consumed a generation of European men was still grinding through its most catastrophic years, and the boy who arrived in that season of bloodshed would spend his entire life in conversation with forces he had not chosen and could not entirely escape. Germany in 1915 was a nation at war with half the world and quietly losing, though few admitted it yet. The optimism of 1914, that peculiar doomed European confidence that the whole affair would be finished by Christmas, had long since been buried in the mud of the Western Front. By the time Suhren drew his first breath, the trenches had become permanent geography, the casualty lists had become routine reading, and the German home front had begun its long, painful education in scarcity. Families in the Ruhr rationed bread and fuel. Women took work their husbands had left behind. Children grew up understanding, before they could fully articulate it, that the world outside was hostile, and that Germany was fighting for its survival against enemies who surrounded it on every front. This was the emotional atmosphere that saturated Suhren's earliest years, even if he was too young to comprehend its political dimensions. The war was simply the condition of existence, as natural and immovable as the factory smoke. When the armistice came in November of 1918, the relief was real, but the humiliation cut deeper and lasted longer. Germany had not been invaded, its cities had not fallen, the army had retreated from foreign soil, and yet suddenly the war was over, and Germany had lost, and no one could explain to ordinary people how that had happened. The answer that filled the vacuum, the idea that Germany had been betrayed from within rather than defeated in the field, took hold with a ferocity that would prove catastrophic in the decades to come. But for a boy barely 3 years old when the guns went quiet, the politics were abstractions. What was concrete was the change in the faces of the adults around him. The returned soldiers who came back diminished, the fathers and uncles who spoke less and drank more, the quiet anger that settled over households like a second winter that never quite lifted. The peace that followed was, by almost any measure, worse than the war for ordinary Germans. The Treaty of Versailles imposed conditions that were experienced not as diplomatic settlement, but as collective punishment, territorial losses, reparations that seemed designed to bleed the country for generations, and military restrictions that reduced one of Europe's great powers to a shroud of its former capability. The Ruhr Valley itself became a flashpoint in the early 1920s, when French and Belgian troops occupied it to enforce reparations payments that Germany could no longer make. For a boy growing up in that region, the humiliation was not abstract or distant. It was soldiers on the street corners. It was restrictions on daily life. It was the visible evidence that Germany had been reduced to something less than sovereign. These years left marks that did not fade. Then came the hyperinflation, a catastrophe so surreal in its proportions that it has passed into legend, though for those who lived through it, the experience was simply grinding and degrading. By the early 1920s, the German mark had collapsed so completely that a wheelbarrow of currency might not buy a loaf of bread. Savings accumulated across lifetimes dissolved into worthlessness in weeks. The middle classes, who had built their security on thrift and steady work, discovered that the entire framework of economic life had become a cruel joke. In the Ruhr, where families depended on industrial wages that were being rapidly outpaced by prices, this period created a bone-deep distrust of institutions, of government, of banks, of the promises of politicians. A child absorbs these lessons not through reading but through observation. The worried faces of parents, the conversations that stopped when children entered the room, the sense that the floor could drop away at any moment. Suhren's family carried a military tradition, and in the Germany of the 1920s, that tradition was a complicated inheritance. The officers who had served the Kaiser found themselves in a republic that many of them despised, stripped of the institutional prestige that had given their profession its meaning. Service was still honorable, still a mark of character and discipline, but the structures that had once given it grandeur had been dismantled. For a family with roots in military service, this created a particular kind of tension, pride in the tradition itself, alongside bitterness at what had been done to it. Young Reinhard grew up absorbing both. the dignity of uniform and duty on one hand, and the anger at what foreign powers and domestic weakness had taken away on the other. It would be too simple to say these feelings made his later choices inevitable, but they created a moral vocabulary from which those choices would eventually be drawn. The Weimar Republic, for all its genuine cultural vitality, the art, the music, the literature that flourished in its brief and turbulent life, never managed to become a democracy that most Germans loved. It was a system that many merely tolerated, associated in the popular imagination with defeat, disorder, and the concessions forced on Germany by its enemies. For young men coming of age in the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Republic offered few inspiring visions of the future. The Great Depression arrived in 1929 and struck Germany with particular force, sending unemployment figures to levels that seemed almost incomprehensible. More than 6 million men out of work at the peak, their families in poverty, their dignity eroded. Political extremism flourished in this soil, and the streets of German cities became battlegrounds between competing visions of what the nation's future should be. It was against this backdrop that Reinhard Suhren began to think seriously about his own future. He was a young man of evident capability and ambition, shaped by a childhood that had given him both a sense of discipline and a profound awareness of national wound. The options available to a young German man of his background and temperament were not unlimited. The institutions that offered genuine structure, genuine purpose, and genuine community were limited in number, and the military, even the diminished, restricted military of the Weimar years, remained one of the most clearly defined paths a young man could take. The Navy in particular carried a specific appeal. It was technical, demanding, and elite in its requirements, and it spoke to something in Suhren's character that responded to precision and challenge. The sea was indifferent and unforgiving, and that honesty had its own attraction for a young man who had grown up in a world full of broken promises. By the early 1930s, as Suhren approached the age at which serious decisions about career and direction had to be made, Germany itself was approaching the decisive rupture of the 20th century. The National Socialist movement had transformed from a fringe of street agitators into a mass political force, and the old elites of German society, the industrialists, the military establishment, the conservative politicians, were making their own calculations about how to manage or harness it. Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January of 1933 did not feel, to everyone who witnessed it, like the beginning of catastrophe. To many it felt like resolution, an end to the paralysis, a restoration of national purpose, a promise that Germany would finally stop being treated as the defeated and start being treated as the powerful. The machinery of a totalitarian state began to assemble itself with terrifying efficiency. But in that first year, the full shape of what was coming was visible only to those willing to see it clearly. For a young man seeking entry into the naval service in these years, the political transformation of Germany was the water he swam in. The Kriegsmarine was rebuilding, carefully, quietly at first, in technical violation of the restrictions Versailles had imposed, and then with increasing openness, as the Nazi government made clear it did not consider itself bound by the old humiliations. Ships were being designed and laid down, officers were being trained, and an institution that had been diminished was reassembling itself into something formidable. To a young man like Suhren, this was opportunity shaped like purpose. The Navy offered a career, a community, a challenge, and a cause. And it offered all of these at exactly the moment when Germany was loudest in its assertion that it was taking its place back among the great powers of the world. We cannot know with certainty what moved through Reinhard Suhren's mind as he made the choice to pursue naval service. because history rarely preserves the private deliberations of young men who have not yet become significant. What we can say is that the choice made sense within the world he had been given, a world of industrial struggle and national humiliation, of military tradition and economic catastrophe, of genuine ambition meeting genuine opportunity, in a moment when the boundaries between patriotism and complicity had not yet been drawn with blood. He was, at this point in his life, nothing more extraordinary than a capable and determined young German who wanted to serve and to excel. The extraordinary and the terrible would come later. For now, there was only the beginning. A boy from the Ruhr Valley, standing at the threshold of a navy and a war that would define everything he would ever become. When Reinhard Suhren walked through the gates of a Kriegsmarine training establishment in 1933, he was stepping into a world that was simultaneously ancient and entirely new. The German Navy had a long institutional memory, traditions of seamanship, discipline, and tactical doctrine stretching back through the imperial fleet and beyond. But the navy he was joining was also something fragile, something carefully reconstructed from the wreckage of defeat. The Versailles Treaty of 1919 had stripped Germany of nearly everything. Her battleships scuttled at Scapa Flow, her naval officer corps gutted, her shipbuilding programs strangled by clause after punishing clause. What remained was a skeleton force, the Kriegsmarine, permitted just enough ships and men to patrol its own coastlines, and little more. When Suhren arrived, that skeleton was beginning to put on muscle again, quietly, methodically, and in many respects, deliberately out of sight of the powers that had written those treaty terms. He was 18 years old, lean with purpose, and he had chosen this life with the particular clarity of a young man who has already decided who he intends to become. The first months of naval training were designed not to teach seamanship, but to break the civilian out of a recruit entirely. Physical conditioning, parade drill, rope work, and the mechanics of absolute obedience to rank. These were the foundations laid before any man was permitted near a navigation chart or a ship's helm. For Suhren, raised in a household that understood structure and duty, this was not entirely foreign territory, but the Navy imposed its own specific brand of rigor, one tied to the particular psychology of men who would one day be responsible for machinery worth millions of marks, and crews whose lives depended on decisions made in seconds. Instructors had no patience for hesitation. They trained hesitation out of a man, the way a surgeon removes infected tissue, not gently, but thoroughly. What emerged from that first phase was an officer candidate, stripped of easy assumptions, rebuilt around the Navy's fundamental demand that a man know exactly what he is doing and do it without trembling. Navigation came next, and it came hard. The open ocean does not forgive errors in calculation. A degree of arc misread on a sextant, a current not accounted for, a barometric reading dismissed too casually. Any of these could place a vessel 30 nautical miles from where her captain believed her to be. Suhren learned celestial navigation, dead reckoning, coastal piloting, and chart work with the same intensity that a concert musician gives to scales, repetitively, rigorously, until the skill lived not in the mind alone, but in the hands and the instincts. He worked alongside other officer candidates, young men from across Germany who had their own reasons for choosing the sea. Some came from naval families and spoke the language of tides and compass headings as naturally as conversation. Others arrived as raw civilians who had to fight for every piece of knowledge. Suhren fell somewhere in between, disciplined enough to absorb the theory quickly, bold enough to push past the boundaries of the classroom and into the practical whenever the opportunity came. Surface ship assignments followed, the traditional path for any officer working his way through the ranks of what was becoming, with increasing confidence, the Kriegsmarine. Adolf Hitler had come to power in January of that same year, 1933, and the effect on Germany's armed forces was already palpable. Rearmament, officially denied but practically underway, meant new money, new ambition, and a new political atmosphere that rewarded military aspiration. Ships that had languished for years began receiving proper maintenance. Expansion plans that had existed only as theoretical documents in locked drawers began to move toward implementation. For junior officers like Suhren, this translated into something very immediate: more ships to serve aboard, more sea time, and the growing sense that the Navy they were building their careers around would eventually be asked to do something real. What that something would be, no one said plainly, but the direction was clear to anyone willing to see it. Aboard surface vessels, light cruisers, torpedo boats, the smaller workhorses of the fleet, Suhren built the foundational skills that no classroom can fully teach. He learned how a ship responds to wind and current in ways that no textbook quite captures. He learned how a crew operates as a single organism when properly led, and how catastrophically it can fragment when it is not. He stood watches in foul weather and fair, navigated narrow coastal passages at night, and absorbed the particular culture of the surface fleet, proud, tradition-bound, and acutely aware of its own limitations. Germany had no aircraft carriers, no deep-water fleet presence in distant oceans, nothing approaching the global reach of the Royal Navy it had once tried and failed to match. The surface fleet was capable, but it was contained. Suhren noticed this. He was too sharp and too restless not to notice. What he could not fully see in those early years was the parallel world being constructed beneath the surface, literally and figuratively. Germany's submarine program, banned outright by the Versailles Treaty, had never truly stopped. It had simply moved. German naval engineers and officers had worked through front companies, through cooperative arrangements with foreign shipyards in Spain and the Netherlands and Finland, refining their technical knowledge and keeping submarine doctrine alive through years when open development was impossible. When Hitler's government began openly tearing up the treaty's provisions, this underground program surfaced. By 1935, Germany had formally announced the existence of a rebuilt submarine fleet. The work that had been done in the shadows now stepped into the light, and the Kriegsmarine suddenly possessed not just the hulls of submarines, but a generation of officers and engineers who understood them intimately. This was not improvised. This was the product of years of careful, deliberate evasion, a fact that said something uncomfortable about the difference between the letter and the spirit of international agreements, and about what a determined state could accomplish when it decided that a treaty was merely an inconvenience. The academies Suhren passed through were not merely technical institutions. They were cultural ones, shaping not just what an officer knew, but how he thought, how he carried himself, what he believed his obligations to be. The Kriegsmarine cultivated a particular self-image, professional, apolitical in its public posture, proud of its traditions, and distinct from the rougher nationalist currents that ran through the army and the emerging SS. Officers were expected to be capable above all else, to value competence as a near-sacred virtue, and to regard the sea as an environment that enforced its own perfect democracy of expertise. It would kill the incompetent regardless of their politics or their connections. Whether this self-image was accurate, whether the Navy was truly as separate from the broader machinery of the Third Reich as it liked to believe, is a question the documentary will return to. For a young officer moving through the system in the mid-1930s, however, these were the values being pressed into him, and he absorbed them alongside his navigation tables and his tactical manuals. Tactics occupied a significant portion of advanced officer training. How do you intercept a faster ship? How do you coordinate an attack with other vessels when communication is unreliable and conditions are deteriorating? How do you press an advantage without exposing yourself to a counterstrike that eliminates everything you have gained? These were not abstract puzzles. They were the professional problems of a navy preparing, however quietly its senior officers might phrase it, for war. Suhren proved himself an apt student of tactical thinking, someone who could absorb the formal doctrine and then bend it against a specific scenario with the kind of flexible intelligence that doctrine alone cannot produce. His instructors noted this quality. In a system where many men could execute a plan reliably, fewer could adapt when the plan ceased to fit the reality. Suhren was one of the fewer. By the mid-1930s, something was shifting in the culture of the Kriegsmarine itself. The surface fleet remained the senior service in terms of tradition and prestige, its capital ships the visible symbols of national revival that the political leadership loved to photograph. But beneath this, almost literally, another culture was taking shape around the submarine arm. The men who had kept the U-boat knowledge alive through the lean years had a certain intensity about them, a conviction that the undersea weapon was not merely one tool among many, but potentially the decisive instrument of any future naval war. Germany had almost strangled Britain with U-boats between 1914 and 1918. A generation of naval thinkers had spent the intervening years asking whether, done differently and on a larger scale, it might succeed entirely. This was the argument that figures like Karl Dönitz were pressing with increasing urgency, and it was an argument that Suhren, still a junior officer on surface ships, was beginning to hear whispered in mess halls and corridors. The world Suhren moved through in these years was one of extraordinary acceleration. Political events that would have been considered impossible a decade earlier were becoming routine. Germany had remilitarized the Rhineland. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 had legitimized the rebuilt Kriegsmarine in the eyes of at least one major power, a diplomatic achievement that served as both validation and warning. Europe was rearranging itself around a Germany that was no longer apologetic about its intentions. For a naval officer watching this from the deck of a surface vessel, the question was not really whether war was coming. The question was what kind of war it would be and where he would stand in it. Suhren was not yet a submariner. He was still learning the foundations, still accumulating the seamanship, the tactical thinking, the physical and mental resilience that any truly capable officer needs before he can specialize effectively. But the pull toward the underwater arm was already present, already forming in the way that significant choices form, not as a sudden decision, but as a slow gravitational movement towards something that fits a particular kind of person in a particular kind of time. The cramped, high-stakes, technically demanding world of the U-boat would demand exactly the qualities that the surface fleet had been drawing out of him. He did not yet know this consciously, but the path was being laid, one careful and relentless year at a time, toward the deep water. There is a moment in every officer's career when the obvious path and the chosen path diverge. For Reinhard Suhren, that moment arrived sometime in the late 1930s, in the quiet, bureaucratic language of a volunteer application form. Surface ships had given him his foundation, the rolling decks, the salt-cracked horizons, the hierarchy of a fleet that prided itself on tradition and visible power. But something else was pulling at him, something less visible, something that moved beneath the surface of the water and, increasingly, beneath the surface of Germany's official military ambitions. He chose the submarines. It was not the obvious choice. It was, in almost every measurable way, the harder one. To understand what that choice meant, you have to understand what the U-boat arm was in 1937 and 1938. Not what it would become in the war years, but what it was in that in-between time, when Germany was rebuilding its military machine, with one eye on its neighbors, and the other on the restrictions it had agreed to honor and quietly chosen to ignore. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from operating submarines at all. For almost 2 decades, that prohibition had held on paper. But paper has never stopped ambition for long, and through the early 1930s, the Kriegsmarine had been laying the groundwork for exactly the fleet the treaty said could not exist. By the time Suhren stepped forward, the submarines were no longer a secret. They were just not yet a proven weapon of war. The men being recruited into this new underwater arm in those years were not, in the main, men who had been broken by failure or who lacked options elsewhere. They were, more often, men who had looked at the conventional career and found something missing in it, a particular kind of challenge that the surface fleet, for all its grandeur, simply could not provide. Submarine service required a different relationship between an officer and his crew. On a destroyer or a cruiser, rank and physical space created natural separation. In a submarine, there was no separation. A commander and his lowest-rated sailor breathed the same recycled air, endured the same hours of silence, and bore the same consequences when things went wrong. Suhren, by the accounts of those who knew him in these years, was someone who understood that. He did not need the distance that rank could buy. The training that awaited him was thorough, in the way that all Kriegsmarine training of the period was thorough, systematic, demanding, and built on a philosophy that preparedness was not a luxury but a survival requirement. Submarine school introduced him to the physics of water pressure and how it behaved against a steel hull at depth. It introduced him to the mechanics of the torpedo, the calculations of bearing and angle, speed and intercept, that would dominate his professional thinking for years to come. It introduced him, perhaps most importantly, to the particular psychology of command in a sealed environment, where the captain's voice was not just an order, but a form of emotional regulation for every man aboard. Fear was not the enemy, the instructors taught. Panic was. Fear, properly managed, was simply information. There was also a political dimension to the timing of his choice that cannot be separated from the professional one. By the late 1930s, Germany was not simply rearming, it was rearming with intent and with speed, and the officer class of the Kriegsmarine was not insulated from that reality. Hitler had come to power when Suhren was still in his early training years. The machinery of the Third Reich had accelerated through his formative career. By the time he volunteered for submarine duty, the Anschluss had absorbed Austria, the Sudetenland had been taken, and anyone paying attention, which every naval officer was, understood that a broader conflict was not a distant possibility, but a near certainty. Men who volunteered for submarines in this period were not stepping into a peacetime adventure. They were positioning themselves at the tip of what German strategic thinking believed would be the decisive instrument of the next war. That strategic thinking had a particular champion, Karl Dönitz. The man who commanded Germany's submarine force in these years was already developing the doctrines that would define the Battle of the Atlantic, the coordinated wolf-pack attacks, the focus on tonnage rather than individual victories, the belief that commerce warfare against Britain could be decisive if prosecuted ruthlessly enough and at sufficient scale. Dönitz was, by all accounts, a commanding presence and a demanding one, and the culture he cultivated in the U-boat arm reflected his own obsessions. He wanted officers who were aggressive, but not reckless, creative, but not undisciplined, capable of acting alone, in the middle of an ocean, but still fundamentally oriented toward the mission he set. Suhren, in those early training months, was learning to be the kind of officer that culture demanded. The boats themselves were a revelation after the open structures of surface vessels. The Type 5 and VX submarines that Germany was producing in increasing numbers by the late 1930s were not large. They were tight, functional machines, designed around the principle that every cubic meter of space had to justify itself with purpose. The forward torpedo room doubled as sleeping quarters for the crew in the bow. The control room was a tangle of wheels and gauges and pipes that a new man could not navigate without brushing against something he did not yet understand. The diesel engines, when running on the surface, produced a noise and vibration that settled into the bones after only a few hours. And beneath it all, always, was the knowledge that the hull separating a man from several hundred meters of cold water was measured in centimeters. Officers who could not make peace with that knowledge did not last in the U-boat arm. Suhren made peace with it. The social world of the submarine service in these years was tight and deliberately cultivated. The Kriegsmarine's leadership understood, partly through doctrine and partly through instinct, that men who would go to sea in these conditions needed to feel that they belonged to something exceptional. The training establishments, the social rituals, the specific language of the service, all of it was designed to create a core identity that distinguished U-boat men from the rest of the Navy. Whether this was wise in a broader moral sense is a question history has had decades to examine. Within the training system itself, the effect was simply cohesion. Suhren emerged from this environment as something more than a competent officer. He emerged as someone who identified wholly with this particular brotherhood. Beyond the borders of the training establishments, 1939 arrived with the inevitability that the previous 2 years had been announcing. When Germany invaded Poland in the first days of September of that year, and Britain and France responded with declarations of war, the world Suhren had been preparing for, finally and irreversibly, became real. The U-boat arm mobilized. The doctrines Dönitz had been sharpening were now live instruments of national policy rather than theoretical frameworks discussed in classrooms. Men who had spent months learning to calculate torpedo solutions in practice scenarios were now being asked to apply those calculations against real ships carrying real cargoes, guarded by real warships, whose captains wanted very much to kill them. The abstract became concrete with startling speed. For Suhren specifically, the outbreak of war represented the end of preparation and the beginning of testing. Everything the training had offered, the seamanship, the torpedo calculations, the management of men in confined and dangerous spaces, now had to prove its worth against an enemy that was not standing still. Britain's Royal Navy was the largest and most experienced naval force in the world at that moment, and its anti-submarine capabilities, while not yet fully developed, were far from negligible. German submariners entering the Atlantic in the autumn and winter of 1939 were not walking into an undefended ocean. They were walking into a contest that both sides understood would determine whether Germany could strangle Britain's supply lines before Britain could find the means to close the trap. What Suhren carried into that contest was not yet a record of achievement. He had not yet sunk a ship. He had not yet commanded men under depth charge attack or navigated a stricken boat back to a French port on little more than determination and mechanical ingenuity. He was, at the start of the war, a trained and capable officer whose potential was still largely theoretical, but potential, in the U-boat arm, had a way of being tested very quickly and very severely. The ocean has no patience for the gap between promise and performance, and neither, in those early war years, did the men who sent young officers out into it. Suhren would have to show what he was made of. The Atlantic, cold and indifferent, and increasingly filled with hunters on both sides, was ready to find out. What none of his instructors could fully prepare him for, and what no training doctrine could adequately capture, was the particular weight of standing at the front of 50 men who would live or die based on decisions you made in the space of seconds, with imperfect information, in total darkness at the bottom of the sea. That weight was coming. He had chosen it, and the choosing, at least, had been entirely his own. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to command. It is not the loneliness of isolation, of empty rooms or silent streets. It is the loneliness of being the one person in a confined steel hull who cannot afford to be wrong. Not once, not by a fraction, not at depth, not in the dark. When Reinhard Suhren stepped into his first commanding role aboard a smaller U-boat in 1940, he inherited that loneliness fully and without ceremony. The German Navy did not celebrate the moment with speeches or pomp. You were handed responsibility the way a man is handed a stone, without explanation of how heavy it would become. He was in his mid-20s, trained, prepared, and yet standing at the threshold of something that training could only approximate and experience alone could teach. The early months of 1940 placed the war at a strange, unsettled angle. Germany's blitzkrieg across Western Europe had stunned the continent, and the Kriegsmarine was still calibrating what role its submarine arm would play in the larger conflict. Karl Dönitz, the driven and obsessive commander of the U-boat fleet, had been arguing for years that submarines were the key to strangling Britain, and now he had a war to prove it. But the fleet available to him in those early months was far smaller than he needed, far fewer boats than his operational plans demanded, and so the commanders who received first commands were stepping into vessels that carried enormous expectation against modest numbers. Suhren understood the gap between those expectations and reality before his first patrol was even underway. He understood it because every officer around him understood it. You went out anyway. The Type 2 boats that formed the backbone of Germany's early submarine fleet were small by any measure, stripped down, maneuverable, and unforgiving. Crews called them Einbäume, a word meaning dugout canoe, and the nickname carried both affection and edge. They were not designed for long Atlantic crossings. Their range was limited, their torpedo capacity modest, and the living conditions aboard were so compressed that privacy became a word without practical meaning. A commander on a Type 2 boat lived among his men in a way that surface ship captains never experienced. Physically close, perpetually visible, unable to retreat into the distance of rank. Suhren adapted to this with a directness that his crew noticed immediately. He did not perform authority. He exercised it quietly, consistently, and they felt the difference. His early patrols took him into the North Sea and the coastal waters around the British Isles, waters that were cold, shallow in places, and heavily trafficked by both enemy vessels and the unpredictable weather systems rolling in off the Atlantic. These were not glamorous hunting grounds. The great convoy battles happening further out in the open ocean would define the war's mythology, but Suhren's early work was conducted in more claustrophobic conditions, where the margin for error was compressed by geography as much as by enemy action. Shallow water is a submarine commander's particular anxiety because it limits depth options during an attack or pursuit. If aircraft spotted you, if a destroyer turned toward you, the equation of escape narrowed dramatically. Suhren ran these calculations constantly, almost unconsciously, until they became instinct. The results of those first patrols were, by the standards of what was coming, modest. Suhren did not return from his initial missions with the kind of tonnage figures that would set Lorient ablaze with celebration. He was competitive enough to feel that absence acutely. Officers of his generation were measured relentlessly in terms of ships sent to the bottom, and those numbers followed a man's career the way a shadow follows a body. But what he did accumulate during those early patrols was arguably more durable than a high tonnage score. He accumulated judgment. He learned when to press and when to hold, how to read the ocean's surface from periscope depth, how to interpret the distant thump of propellers into something close to tactical intelligence. These were skills that could not be written into training manuals, because they existed in the space between the manual and the moment. His crew during these first commands watched him the way crews always watch a new captain, carefully, without obvious scrutiny, measuring him against some internal standard they had assembled from experience and instinct. A submarine crew's confidence in their commander is not an abstract thing, it is utterly physical. It lives in the quality of the silence when he gives an order, in the speed with which men move when he calls for a crash dive, in the steadiness of his voice when depth charges are falling somewhere in the water column above. Suhren passed these evaluations not through bravado, but through something more useful, through the visible quality of his thinking. His crew could see him process, could see the moment calculation resolved into decision, and they trusted the process before they fully trusted the man. By 1941, the character of the submarine war was shifting in ways that required continuous adaptation. The fall of France had given the Kriegsmarine access to the Biscay ports, Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, Bordeaux, dramatically reducing the transit distance to the Atlantic hunting grounds and extending the operational range of every boat in the fleet. For Suhren, this meant the possibility of longer patrols, deeper Atlantic penetration, and engagements with the convoys that Dönitz so desperately wanted to cut apart. The wolf pack tactics were being refined. The communication networks between boats and command were improving, and the whole apparatus of the U-boat campaign was becoming something more systematic, more lethal, and more demanding of its commanders. Suhren moved into this evolving environment with the accumulated confidence of his earlier patrols behind him, his rough edges worn into competence. There is an important distinction between a bold commander and a reckless one, and Suhren was already demonstrating which category he belonged to by the time his second year of command began. He pressed attacks when the tactical picture supported aggression, and he disengaged when it did not, a discipline that many younger commanders struggled to maintain in the intoxication of the hunt. The Atlantic rewarded patience almost as often as it rewarded speed, and Suhren had a patience that coexisted with his aggression without contradiction. He could hold position, maintain silence, wait out an escort's search pattern with the stillness of a man who had made peace with uncertainty. Then, when the angle opened, he moved with a decisiveness that impressed even senior officers reviewing his patrol logs back at base. The relationship between a U-boat commander and his crew was unlike almost any other command relationship in the military world of 1940 and 1941. On land, a commanding officer might be separated from his men by distance, by hierarchy, by the physical geography of the battlefield. At sea, aboard a submarine, those separations collapsed. You breathed the same recycled air, endured the same temperatures, heard the same sounds. When a depth charge exploded close enough to crack the light fixtures and send men stumbling against bulkheads, the fear was collective property. It belonged to all of them equally, including the captain. What distinguished the captain was not an absence of fear, but what he did with it. In the seconds immediately following, Suhren's men learned, patrol by patrol, that he did not freeze. He assessed and he acted, and that consistency became the foundation on which their trust was built. His reputation spread the way reputation spreads in a military service, through the accounts of men who had served with him, through the careful language of official reports, through the particular attention that senior commanders pay to junior officers who consistently return from patrol, with something to show and something to teach. Donitz ran his U-boat arm with an intensity that bordered on personal investment in each captain's performance, and officers who demonstrated both tactical skill and the ability to manage their crews effectively were noted and remembered. Suhren was being noted. He was not yet famous, not yet decorated with the medals that would come later, but he was becoming the kind of officer about whom certain things were quietly said. That he was steady, that he was sharp, that he did not waste men or torpedoes. The North Sea and coastal Atlantic waters of 1940 and 1941 cost the Kriegsmarine considerably. Other commanders who had received first commands around the same time as Suhren did not all survive them. The attrition rate among U-boat crews was already significant in those early years, even before Allied countermeasures reached their devastating later effectiveness. Every man who went to sea in a submarine understood at some level that the mathematics of the campaign were playing a long game against them, that each patrol incrementally adjusted the odds. Suhren absorbed this knowledge without allowing it to become paralysis. He was realistic about the dangers, in a way that made him careful rather than hesitant, and his men absorbed that tone from him the way sailors absorb everything from a captain, gradually, unconsciously, and completely. What those first commands gave Reinhard Suhren was not glory. They gave him something more transferable, more applicable to what was coming. They gave him a working model of himself as a commander, tested under genuine pressure, refined by actual consequence, validated not by medals pinned to a uniform in a ceremony on the dock, but by the simple, hard-won fact that he and his crew had gone out and come back. In the economy of submarine warfare, that was the first and most essential currency. Everything else, the tonnage, the decorations, the fame that would eventually attach itself to his name, would be built on this foundation, on these early patrols in cold northern waters, where a young captain had learned, by degrees and by necessity, exactly what he was made of. By 1942, the North Atlantic had become something that defied easy description. It was not merely a battlefield, it was a grinding, relentless machine that consumed men and ships with equal indifference. The cold had a quality to it that seasoned sailors never fully found words for, a bone-deep wet chill that settled into everything, the steel walls, the bedding, the bread, the lungs. For Reinhard Suhren, these waters were no longer new. He had already spent months learning their rhythms, their moods, their particular cruelties. But 1942 brought something different. The scale of the war at sea had shifted from a series of duels into something closer to systematic slaughter, and Suhren was now deep inside the machinery of it. The strategic concept driving Germany's naval campaign was brutally straightforward. Britain was an island nation whose survival depended entirely on the flow of supplies crossing the Atlantic. Fuel, food, ammunition, steel, and the men to carry them. If those supply lines could be severed, or even throttled, Britain's capacity to fight would collapse. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz had built the U-boat arm around this single, unforgiving logic. He understood that no individual submarine, no matter how skilled its captain, could break Britain alone. What was needed was coordination. Many boats operating together across wide stretches of ocean, funneling convoys into killing grounds, where numbers would overwhelm escort defenses. These coordinated formations became known as wolf packs, and by 1942, they were operating with a devastating effectiveness that sent Allied planners into crisis. The mechanics of a wolf pack attack were both intricate and brutal. A line of submarines would be strung out across several hundred kilometers of ocean, each boat positioned to maximize the chance that at least one would sight a convoy. When contact was made, the sighting boat did not immediately attack. Instead, it radioed its position to Naval Command at Lorient, which then directed other boats in the area toward the target. The attacking submarine held back, shadowing the convoy on the surface, transmitting updated position reports, and waiting as its sister boats converged across open water. Only when sufficient numbers had gathered did Dönitz authorize the assault, typically at night, when escort radar was less effective, when the silhouettes of merchant ships stood out against the horizon, and when surfaced U-boats were nearly invisible. For the merchant crews aboard those ships, the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong was often a flash of light and a column of water, followed seconds later by the sound. Suhren understood the Wolfpack system with the clarity of someone who had already watched it work and seen it fail. He knew that coordination with other boats depended on radio contact, and that every transmission was a potential liability. Allied direction-finding equipment was improving, and a boat that talked too much risked giving away its position before it could strike. He developed a discipline around communication, transmitting only what was essential and breaking off as quickly as possible. His crew learned to read his silences as precisely as his commands. In a vessel where 60 men shared a space roughly the size of a city bus, with no privacy, no fresh air, and almost no natural light, the captain's mood was not a personal matter. It was operational information. Suhren kept his composure, not as a performance, but as a form of tactical necessity, and his crew absorbed that steadiness. The convoys themselves were not passive targets. By the middle of 1942, Allied escort commanders were learning hard lessons and applying them with growing skill. Destroyers and corvettes prowled the perimeter of every convoy formation, equipped with sonar, depth charges, and crews who had traded their initial confusion for a cold, practiced efficiency. Aircraft added another dimension to the threat. Flying boats and long-range patrol bombers were beginning to cover sections of the Atlantic that had once been considered safe transit zones. For U-boat crews, the appearance of an aircraft was among the most frightening things the ocean could produce. On the surface, a submarine was fast enough to outrun most escorts. Against an aircraft diving out of low cloud cover, with bombs or depth charges already released, there was almost no margin at all. Suhren had already learned the merciless arithmetic of the crash dive. When an aircraft was spotted, the bridge watch had seconds, sometimes fewer, to descend from the conning tower, seal the hatch, and take the boat below the surface. The difference between a successful crash dive and a catastrophic one was measured not in minutes, but in heartbeats. He drilled his crew relentlessly, running practice dives until the sequence became muscle memory rather than conscious thought. Every second shaved from the dive time was a second further from a bomb pattern. Every redundant motion eliminated was a life that might be saved. The boat's interior, already a labyrinth of pipes and gauges and narrow passageways, became a kind of precision instrument that Suhren tuned through repetition and exacting standards. His crew grumbled in the way that sailors always grumble, but they performed. What the Wolfpack campaigns of 1942 produced, at the scale of the entire Atlantic, was a form of attrition so total that both sides were effectively bleeding out simultaneously. Allied losses in merchant tonnage during this period reached figures that no propaganda from either side could entirely conceal. Ships carrying food for British cities, fuel for Allied armies, equipment for the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program, all of it lay on the ocean floor in quantities that strained comprehension. And yet the U-boat arm was losing boats too. in numbers that Dönitz absorbed with a kind of terrible pragmatism, knowing that the loss rate was sustainable only as long as his crews could be replaced faster than Allied shipyards could build new escorts. It was not a war of heroism in any comfortable sense. It was arithmetic applied to human beings. For Suhren, the weight of this reality was not something that sat easily alongside the operational demands of command. He was not, by the accounts that have survived, an introspective man who sought elaborate philosophical frameworks for what he did. He was a naval officer who had chosen a profession, entered a war, and was now executing his function with the tools he had been given. But the Atlantic did not allow its participants to remain entirely insulated from consequence. A merchant ship sinking in darkness was not an abstraction. The men on those vessels were not combatants in any meaningful military sense. They were engineers, cooks, deckhands, navigators, who had signed on to carry cargo and found themselves in the geometry of a submarine war. Suhren knew this, as every U-boat commander knew it, and the knowing did not stop the attacks. That contradiction, clear awareness, alongside continuing action, sits at the heart of any honest account of the Battle of the Atlantic. The physical conditions aboard U-boats during extended patrols added a layer of suffering that was entirely separate from combat. A Type Visic boat on a 3-week patrol carried provisions for its crew in every conceivable space. Sausages hanging from the ceiling of the forward torpedo room, canned goods stacked in the bilges, bread that went moldy within days. The atmosphere inside the pressure hull became thick with condensation, diesel fumes, cooking smells, and the accumulated odor of men who could not bathe. Mold grew on clothing and leather. Electrical equipment sparked and corroded. The noise of depth charges, whether near or distant, traveled through the hull with a physical force that was not merely heard but felt in the chest cavity and the teeth. Men developed nervous habits, superstitions, rituals. The idea that submarine warfare was a clean or clinical profession could not survive a single patrol in actual conditions. Suhren navigated all of this with a kind of ground-level authority that commanded genuine respect rather than mere obedience. He was not known as a captain who ruled through fear or distance. He ate the same food as his crew, slept in a bunk no more comfortable than theirs, and was present in the control room at critical moments, not because regulations required it, but because his crew functioned better when they could see him thinking. In a war that produced its share of commanders who led from the rear, Suhren's proximity to the danger was something his men carried with them as a form of reassurance. If the captain was calm, the situation was being managed. If the captain was working the problem, then the problem could still be worked. That kind of leadership was not taught in any academy. It was built in the dark, under pressure, over time. By the close of 1942, something had shifted in the balance of the war at sea that not every U-boat commander had yet fully registered. Allied code-breaking efforts, coordinated escort group tactics, and the gradual extension of air cover were beginning to erode the Wolfpack's advantage in ways that aggregate statistics would only confirm months later. Suhren could feel the change, even if he could not yet quantify it. The escorts were faster in response, the air cover more persistent, the convoys better organized. What had been a hunter's war was not yet a hunted man's war, but the direction of travel was becoming clear to those who paid careful attention. He paid careful attention. That quality, the refusal to let success obscure the growing shape of strategic reality, would distinguish him from commanders who mistook tactical victories for strategic advantage and kept pressing forward into water that was growing steadily more lethal. The Atlantic was changing. Suhren changed with it, for now. The winter of 1943 settled over the occupied French port of Lorient like a cold verdict. The harbour, once a modest commercial anchorage, had been transformed into one of the most formidable submarine bases in the world. Concrete pens, thick enough to shrug off aerial bombardment, service gantries rising over rows of grey steel hulls, and the constant smell of diesel fuel hanging in the salt air like a permanent weather condition. For the men of the U-boat arm, Lorient was both home and departure point, a place where you arrived exhausted from the Atlantic and left again knowing the odds were quietly, persistently worsening. It was here, in the opening months of that year, that Reinhard Suhren walked across a frost-slicked dock and placed his hand on the conning tower of U-564 for the first time as her commanding officer. He paused there for a moment, not from hesitation, but from the particular kind of attention that experienced submariners bring to any new boat, reading her the way a horseman reads an unfamiliar animal. What he found was a vessel with a history, a crew with memories, and a war that was growing more complicated by the week. U-564 was a Type 7 Charlie, the backbone of Germany's underwater campaign, and arguably the most produced submarine class in history. She measured just over 76 meters from bow to stern, a fact that sounds substantial until you are standing inside her and realize that every centimeter of that length is consumed by machinery, torpedoes, provisions, and the bodies of roughly 50 men living in conditions that would have troubled a medieval prisoner. Her diesel engines could push her across the surface at a reasonable pace, while her electric motors carried her beneath the waves at considerably less speed, demanding careful management of battery reserves during any prolonged dive. She displaced roughly 760 tons when submerged, heavy enough to absorb punishment, light enough to dive fast when aircraft appeared without warning. Her torpedo capacity gave her genuine striking power, and a deck gun offered additional flexibility against unescorted targets, though using it required surfacing, and with that came exposure. She was, in the language of her designers, a weapons platform optimized for endurance and lethality. In the language of the men who served aboard her, she was a steel tube that smelled of oil and damp clothing, where privacy was a concept everyone had quietly agreed to forget. The boat's record before Suren's arrival was neither glorious nor dismal. It occupied that middle ground that makes command simultaneously an opportunity and a challenge. Previous patrols had yielded results, but inconsistently, and the crew carried the particular mixture of experience and uncertainty that accumulates when a boat has seen genuine action without ever finding a clean, defining success. Some men aboard had already survived depth charge attacks, had felt the hull flex under the pressure of near misses, had watched their boat surface into daylight they were not certain they would see again. That kind of experience either hardens a crew into something formidable or settles into them as a slow, corrosive anxiety. Suhren understood this distinction immediately. He had spent enough time aboard operational boats to recognize the difference between wariness and fear, between a crew that had been tested and a crew that had been worn down. His first task, before any patrol could be considered, was to know precisely which category his new command occupied. He began with observation rather than declaration. In his first days aboard U-564, Suhren moved through the boat with the unhurried attention of a man assembling a picture rather than confirming a prejudice. He watched the torpedo crew run their routines, noting where economy of motion had become habit and where small inefficiencies had been quietly absorbed into the daily rhythm without anyone thinking to challenge them. He sat in the control room during simulated dives, timing the sequence with the kind of focus that made experienced petty officers straighten instinctively without being told to. He ate the same food as the crew, slept in the same cramped quarters, and asked questions that were precise enough to signal expertise, without being aggressive enough to signal distrust. It was a method he had developed across earlier commands, not warmth for its own sake, but the deliberate construction of mutual understanding, because in a submarine, the distance between a captain's competence and his crew's confidence is measured in seconds that can never be recovered once lost. What emerged from those early days was a clearer picture than the boat's paper record had suggested. The crew was skilled in ways that mattered. The engineering staff understood their machinery with the intimate familiarity that only repeated crisis teaches, and the watch officers had good instincts for the surface conditions of the Atlantic. What they lacked was cohesion under sustained pressure, the kind of seamless, collective reflex that only emerges when every man trusts, not just his own judgment, but the judgment of the man beside him. Individual competence and collective precision are related but distinct qualities, and U-boat warfare demands both simultaneously. Suhren decided that his training program would not correct deficiencies so much as forge connections between departments, between watch rotations, between the theoretical and the visceral. He wanted a crew that did not think about what to do next, because thinking takes time, and time underwater is the currency you cannot afford to spend carelessly. The training that followed was relentless by any measure. Suhren drove the crew through emergency dive drills at intervals irregular enough to prevent anticipation, because real emergencies do not announce themselves. He ran torpedo attack simulations until the sequence from target acquisition to firing solution became something close to instinct, the calculations flowing through the attack team with the fluency of practiced speech. He tested the engineering crew with simulated mechanical failures, pulling the scenario from the ordinary into the extreme and watching how they adapted when the comfortable answer was no longer available. He paid particular attention to the boat's dive time, the interval between a lookout's cry and the moment the hull disappeared beneath the surface, and he shaved that interval down with a persistence that became a point of crew pride rather than resentment. A boat that dives faster than an aircraft can acquire and attack its target is a boat that survives. Suhren had internalized this arithmetic long before he stepped aboard U-564, and he intended his crew to feel it in their muscles. He was demanding without being theatrical about it. Officers who had served under commanding officers who performed their authority, who raised their voices at carefully chosen moments to remind the crew of their status, found Suhren's manner initially difficult to read. He did not perform. When something was done wrong, he identified it, explained what correct looked like, and moved on. When something was done exceptionally well, he noted it in the same even register, which had the paradoxical effect of making his approval feel more substantial than praise delivered with ceremony. Discipline aboard U-564, under his command, was less a set of imposed rules than a shared standard, one that the crew gradually adopted as their own, because Suhren himself applied it to everything he did without exception. The captain who holds himself to the same measure he demands of his men creates a different kind of authority than the captain who exempts himself from that measure, and the crew of U-564 understood the difference, even if they did not articulate it in those terms. There were officers among the boat's complement who became central to Suhren's command in ways that extended beyond their formal roles. His watch officers carried responsibility for the boat during hours when the captain himself needed rest, and Suhren invested genuine time in their development, not micromanaging their decisions, but building their confidence in making them independently. Because a captain who cannot trust his officers to command competently in his absence has not built a crew, he has built a dependency. The navigator received particular attention because Suhren believed that positional accuracy in the Atlantic knowing where you were to a degree of precision that the ocean perpetually conspired against, was the foundation on which every tactical decision rested. Get the navigation right, and everything else becomes possible. Get it wrong, and tactical brilliance is merely a more elaborate form of getting lost. By the time the worst of winter had begun to lift from Lorient's harbor, something had changed aboard U-564. It was not dramatic or sudden, but the crew who had received Suhren with the guarded evaluation that submariners bring to any new commanding officer had reached a conclusion about the man who now commanded their lives. He knew the boat. He knew his trade. He was neither reckless nor timid, and in a war that tended to consume men who erred in either direction, this was a quality with very practical survival implications. Morale, that elusive but essential element of any fighting unit's effectiveness, had shifted from functional to genuine. Men had begun to compete with themselves, to take pride in their own mastery, to want the boat to perform well, because they had internalized her performance as a reflection of their own quality. This is what good command produces when it works as it should, and it is rarer than any decoration or citation. The strategic context surrounding this transformation was not reassuring. 1943 was a year in which the U-boat arm's collective confidence, so robust in the preceding years, had begun to encounter the friction of an enemy that was learning, adapting, and committing industrial and technological resources to anti-submarine warfare on a scale that no German planner had initially anticipated. Allied air coverage over the Atlantic was extending. Escort groups were becoming more tactically sophisticated, and the wolf pack operations that had yielded such devastating results in earlier years were beginning to encounter coordinated responses that reduced their effectiveness. Suhren understood all of this. He was not a man who substituted optimism for analysis, and he read the evolving operational picture with the same precision he brought to everything else. The Atlantic that U-564 would sail into was more dangerous than the one that had made German submarines feared. That knowledge was not a reason to refuse the patrol order. Refusal was not a category that existed in his professional universe, but it was a reason to be better prepared than any enemy anticipated. When the orders arrived and the date for departure was set, U-564 prepared to leave the grey shelter of Lorient's concrete pens and put her bow against the open ocean. The stores came aboard in careful sequence, provisions for weeks at sea, torpedoes loaded and secured, fuel tanks filled to capacity, technical manuals and charts updated to account for the latest intelligence on convoy routes and Allied patrol patterns. The crew moved through these preparations with a quiet efficiency that was itself a form of communication, each man's competence visible to the men around him, the whole representing something that had not existed when Suhren first stepped aboard. He had arrived to find a boat with potential and a crew with experience. What departed from Lorient was something more considered, a unit shaped by weeks of deliberate preparation, commanded by a man who had turned professional discipline into a collective identity. The Atlantic waited, indifferent and vast. Suhren had done what he could to meet it. To understand Reinhard Suhren's genius as a submarine commander, one must first understand the machine he would master. U-564 was not merely a vessel, it was an engineering marvel and a death trap wrapped in welded steel, a cramped kingdom where fewer than 50 men lived in conditions that would break most human spirits. The Type V submarine represented the apex of German submarine design in the middle years of the war, a platform so refined and so deadly that it would become the most produced combat submarine in history. Suhren inherited this boat in early 1943, when she had already seen combat under previous captains, already earned a mixed reputation, and already borne the weight of men's fears and hopes. To take command was to accept responsibility, not just for a machine, but for a floating tomb that might save him or entomb him and all his crew beneath the cold Atlantic. The boat's specifications were precise, unforgiving, and entirely dependent upon the judgment and skill of the man who stood in the control room when the moment of danger arrived. At just over 76 meters in length and roughly 9 meters in beam, U-564 was compact by any standard, a vessel that felt simultaneously enormous when one was outside her hull and impossibly claustrophobic when confined within. Submerged, she displaced approximately 760 tons, a figure that represented her mass when ballast tanks were flooded, and she became, literally, a stone dropped into the ocean's depths. This tonnage figure was deceptive in its simplicity because every ton represented an engineering choice, a compromise between speed and stealth, between firepower and endurance, between the desire to survive and the expectation that one might not. The pressure hull, the inner cylinder of hardened steel where the crew lived and worked, was only roughly 4.7 meters in diameter, so narrow that two men could scarcely pass each other in the narrow corridor without turning sideways, so confining that claustrophobia was not merely a psychological possibility, but an everyday physical reality. The outer hull, which gave the submarine her hydrodynamic shape, surrounded this pressure hull and created ballast tanks in the space between them. These compartments could be flooded or blown dry through a series of valves and compressed air lines that were themselves a marvel of engineering, but also a constant source of potential catastrophe if anything malfunctioned or if a depth charge explosion ruptured the delicate plumbing that kept the boat alive. The U-564's power plant consisted of 2 diesel engines that ran on the surface or when snorkeling just beneath the waves, pushing the boat through the water at speeds approaching 18 knots when running fast on the surface. Below the waterline, these diesels were worthless. Instead, 2 electric motors, powered by a massive battery bank stored in compartments below the crew's living spaces, provided propulsion when submerged. These batteries were the boat's lifeblood and also her curse. When submerged, U-564 could maintain roughly 7.5 knots indefinitely, but only until the batteries discharged to dangerously low levels, at which point she had to surface or snorkel to recharge them. This fundamental limitation meant that a submarine was not truly a submarine at all in the modern sense. It was a surface ship that could hide underwater for limited periods. Suhren understood this limitation with bone-deep clarity because his life depended upon never forgetting it. The battery compartments were also where the poisonous chlorine gas could form if seawater ever breached the hull and contaminated the battery acid, a threat so terrible that every man on the boat knew the symptoms of chlorine poisoning and the reality that no antidote existed except escaping to fresh air, which might not be possible. The U-564's armament was formidable by the standards of the day, though it would seem quaint compared to weapons that would emerge after the war's end. She carried 5 torpedo tubes, 4 mounted in the bow, and 1 mounted in the stern. These were not the primitive devices of the First World War. They were sophisticated weapons that could be set to run at various depths, though their settings were often unreliable, and their tendency to malfunction cost German submariners far more sunk merchant ships than any Allied countermeasure. Each torpedo was roughly 7 meters long and packed with explosives that, when detonated against a ship's hull, could break a vessel in half or flood her compartments faster than pumps could keep pace. U-564 could carry up to 14 torpedoes total, though this meant packing the boat so tightly that there was literally no room for the crew to move between bunks and equipment. The reload process for torpedo tubes was labor-intensive and dangerous, requiring men to manually extract spent tubes, wrestle heavy ordnance into position, and prepare the mechanisms while the boat was in motion or in danger. Suhren insisted on constant training in torpedo drills, because speed in reloading could mean the difference between sinking one merchant ship or three before escorts could force him to dive deep and disengage. On the deck, forward of the conning tower, U-564 carried a formidable 88mm deck gun, a weapon that could engage ships on the surface without expending precious torpedoes. This gun was remarkable. It could deliver high explosive shells with devastating accuracy, had rapid rate of fire compared to most ship-mounted guns of its era, and gave the U-boat captain options that pure underwater warfare did not provide. The gun crew consisted of 4 men: a loader, a layer who aimed the weapon, a trainer who adjusted traverse, and the gun captain who gave fire orders. These men were among the boat's most exposed, and therefore most vulnerable, standing on the deck in the open air, with nothing but their courage, and the boat's speed to protect them if enemy aircraft or escort vessels appeared. Suhren valued the deck gun highly, not only for its lethality, but because it allowed him to surface and engage weakly defended merchant ships from above the water, saving torpedoes for more dangerous prey. The gun required constant maintenance, careful storage of ammunition in waterproof containers, and drill after drill to ensure the gun crew could be ready within minutes of the order to surface. The conning tower rose from the pressure hull like a periscope itself, a streamlined structure that housed the command center of the submarine when she was surfaced. Within the conning tower were the attack periscope and the search periscope, both of which extended upward through the tower's roof when raised and retracted completely when submerged. These optical instruments were the submarine captain's primary means of seeing the world when his boat was submerged. 2 small mirrors at the top of long steel tubes that somehow transmitted an image down to the eyepiece. The search periscope had a wider field of view, useful for scanning the horizon, while the attack periscope offered magnification and special markings that allowed a captain to estimate range and bearing to targets. Both periscopes were enormous sources of potential water leakage, and both had been known to break at critical moments, leaving a captain blind and helpless. Suhren trained himself to read the ocean through these limited windows, to interpret wave patterns and the distant shapes of ships with such accuracy that he could calculate approach vectors and firing solutions with remarkable precision. The periscope operators who trained under him learned to sweep the horizon with mechanical precision, understanding that a momentary loss of focus, a missed glimpse of an approaching escort destroyer, could result in their deaths. The interior of U-564 was organized with ruthless efficiency into 6 compartments, each sealed off from the others by watertight doors that could be shut instantly if the boat took on water. Forward was the torpedo room, a cramped space where the 4 bow tubes were loaded and maintained, where torpedoes were stored in racks on the walls and overhead, where living space was sacrificed entirely to lethality. Behind that came the officers' quarters, where the captain and his watch officers slept in narrow bunks stacked 3 high, where the few charts and papers that guided the boat's navigation were carefully stored. Next came the central control room, the heart of the boat, where the diving plane's operator sat at his controls, where the chief of the watch monitored the flood valves and main vents, where the captain stood during battle, and from which all orders flowed. The diesel engine room occupied the middle section, a hot, loud, diesel-fueled chamber where the 2 engines roared and vibrated, where the air was thick with fumes and heat, where the engineering officers, who kept the boat alive, performed their duties, with sweat dripping constantly. Behind that came the electric motor room, where massive electric motors drove the boat through underwater darkness, where batteries underneath provided silent power and poisonous potential. Finally, the stern compartment held the aft torpedo tube, crew sleeping quarters for the enlisted men, and the stern plane's operator, who controlled the boat's vertical movement from the aft end. Every compartment was connected by narrow passageways, barely wide enough for one man. Every surface was covered with pipes and gauges and cables, and every cubic centimeter of space was allocated with calculation. Suhren understood that mastery of U-564 meant understanding not just her specifications, but her personality, her quirks, her particular vulnerabilities and strengths. A boat built in one yard might handle slightly differently from an identical boat built in another yard. Tolerances in manufacturing meant that no two type boats were absolutely identical. Suhren learned how U-564 preferred to dive, how quickly she responded to the diving planes, how deep she could safely go before hull pressure approached the vessel's crushing limit, approximately 700 meters below the surface. He learned which valve in the diesel room tended to weep seawater when the seas grew rough, which periscope lens had a slight distortion in its upper quadrant that could mislead a captain estimating range, which electrical compartment had a tendency to produce excessive chlorine gas under certain temperature conditions. He learned the names and capabilities of every man on the boat, understanding that the engineer who could coax extra revolutions from the diesels during a surface chase, or the radio man who could detect an escort vessel's presence through ambient electrical noise, mattered as much to survival as any mechanical specification. The vessel's true capability existed not in the German engineer's blueprints, but in the synthesis of design, crew skill, and captain's judgment. The speed at which U-564 could move through the water, 18 knots on the surface, roughly 7.5 knots submerged, were specifications that meant everything in the context of Atlantic warfare. A merchant convoy might travel at 8 or 9 knots, which meant that U-564 on the surface could overtake it if Suhren spotted it in sufficient time. But an Allied escort destroyer or frigate could achieve speeds of 15 to 20 knots or more, meaning that surface engagement with escorts was essentially a suicide run unless Suhren possessed overwhelming tactical advantage. Submerged, U-564 was actually slower than the escorts that hunted her, which meant that once an escort had detected his position and attacked, Suhren's only option was to go deep and attempt to move laterally away from the threat, while silent running disabled his ability to hear what was approaching. This asymmetry of speed and vulnerability shaped every decision a submarine captain made. Speed on the surface meant visibility. The diesel exhaust could be seen. The bow wave and wake created patterns visible to aircraft and lookouts. The noise of the engines could be detected by hydrophones. Speed underwater meant battery drain and reduced endurance. Suhren had to calculate constantly the balance between moving fast enough to position U-564 for an attack and moving quietly enough to avoid detection in the first place. The acoustic signature of U-564 was as important as her speed, perhaps more important in the age of increasingly sophisticated Allied sonar. When silent running at minimal speed, the boat could sometimes evade escorts by moving so quietly that her presence could not be detected by the mechanical ears towed behind destroyers or mounted on their hulls. The electric motors were significantly quieter than diesel engines, but they consumed battery power at frightening rates. The propeller itself could create cavitation noise if the boat moved too quickly, a phenomenon that occurred when water pressure at the propeller blade dropped too low and bubbles formed, creating acoustic signatures that betrayed the boat's position to any listening escort. Suhren trained his crew to maintain absolute silence during deep dives, ordering all unnecessary machinery shut down, forbidding conversations above whispers, requiring shoes to be removed so that footsteps would not ring out through steel compartments and potentially be detected by hydrophones sensitive enough to hear sound waves traveling through water. The psychological pressure of this silence, combined with the knowledge that active pinging from sonar was searching for them, that depth charges were being loaded into racks above, produced a particular species of terror that regular sailors never experienced. The Type Vehic design represented the culmination of decades of submarine warfare evolution, incorporating lessons learned from the First World War and refinements developed throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. The welded hull was stronger than the riveted hulls of earlier submarines, allowing for deeper diving and greater crush depth. The streamlined design reduced water resistance and increased speed compared to earlier, more angular designs. The electrical systems were more reliable, the diesel engines more efficient, the torpedo mechanisms more sophisticated. Yet despite all these improvements, U-564 was still fundamentally a product of wartime compromise and manufacturing under strain. Steel that should have been allowed to age properly was used fresh from the furnace. Welders working around the clock made occasional flaws that could crack under pressure. Components manufactured in different factories sometimes did not fit together precisely as designed. U-564 was a marvel of engineering, but she was also a boat built by a nation at war, by workers exhausted and underfed, using materials diverted from other critical purposes. Reinhard Suhren took command of this vessel and made her his own, through an almost obsessive familiarity with every system, every gauge, every potential point of failure. He spent hours in the engine rooms discussing diesel mechanics with his engineers, understanding not just how the engines worked, but why they sometimes failed, and what could be done to coax additional performance from them under extreme conditions. He worked with his torpedo officer to understand the temperamental nature of the weapons that were supposed to be his primary means of inflicting damage on the enemy, learning which depth settings were most reliable, and how to calculate firing solutions with precision that seemed almost supernatural to his crew. He stood watches at the periscope until his eyes burned with fatigue, learning to read the shape of a ship's superstructure from 1,000 meters away and identify vessel types with extraordinary accuracy. He memorized the acoustic characteristics of different escort vessels, understanding that the particular frequency of a frigate's propeller noise differed from a destroyer's, and that this knowledge could be used to evade one threat while maneuvering toward another. U-564 was not merely a boat to Suhren. She was an extension of his mind, a tool that he had honed to an edge so fine that every other submarine captain in the German Navy understood they were competing not just against an army. Chapter 8. Narration. The spring of 1943 arrived with deceptive promise. The Atlantic, though still treacherous, was beginning to offer windows of opportunity, brief moments when the stars aligned, when convoy positions fell into predictable patterns, and when a captain with the right instincts might exploit the gap between one escort vessel's search radius and another's. Reinhard Suhren stood in the conning tower of U-564, hands gripped to the cold steel, watching his crew complete the final checks before departure. They had trained relentlessly over the preceding weeks, learning not just the mechanics of the boat, but the rhythms of their new captain's mind. Suhren was no believer in lengthy speeches or theatrical displays of confidence. Instead, he moved through the boat with methodical precision, his presence itself a kind of communication, a silent assertion that competence, not fear, would define their patrols. The crew of more than 50 men had come to respect this quality, though respect in a submarine was always tinged with the awareness that it functioned alongside dread. As U-564 prepared to slip away from her berth, the larger context of the Atlantic War pressed invisibly around them. The Allies were tightening their grip month by month, but German U-boats still operated in coordinated groups, still scored successes, and still represented a genuine threat to British and American shipping. The boats slid beneath the surface, with the practiced ease of men who had learned to manage controlled panic in confined spaces. Suren's first patrol, as her captain, would follow a carefully plotted course northward and westward, away from the heavily defended convoy routes nearest to the British Isles, toward more distant waters, where merchant traffic still moved with less complete protection. The voyage itself was a study in the unglamorous reality of submarine warfare. For hours, sometimes days, there was nothing but the hum of the diesel engines when operating on the surface, the hiss of the electric motors beneath, and the constant background noise of compressed air, pumping systems, and the creaks of the hull responding to pressure changes. The men who served beneath the waves learned to navigate by senses that land dwellers never developed. The captain and his officers could read the ocean's moods through countless subtle signs, through the behavior of their equipment and the movement of the boat itself. Suhren spent much of those early days studying his crew's responses, noting which men moved efficiently through the cramped passageways even under stress, which voices remained calm during emergency drills, and which showed the small signs of strain that might one day cost them their lives. The Type Vajek was a masterpiece of compact engineering, but also a prison from which there was no escape if something went wrong. That fundamental fact colored every interaction aboard. The crew's confidence in their captain had to be absolute, because in a crisis, hesitation could mean the difference between reaching safety and sinking with all hands. After nearly 2 weeks of transit through waters that were dangerous but not yet actively hostile, U-564 reached her operational patrol area. Suhren had chosen this sector carefully, consulting the intelligence summaries that came from U-boat headquarters, noting the frequency of reported sightings and the patterns that emerged when you studied convoy movement across weeks and months. The approach to the hunting ground was itself a lesson in caution. Every periscope observation carried a risk, the smallest error in depth keeping, or a moment's hesitation in retracting the scope, could betray the submarine's position to a watching escort. The Atlantic air was cold, the skies frequently grey and overcast, which was fortunate because cloud cover was a submarine's greatest asset. Clear skies meant Allied aircraft could range freely, turning the ocean into a killing zone, where a U-boat was nearly defenseless. Suhren established a routine that would characterize his entire command of U-564: careful observation, patient stalking, and precise timing. He did not attack the first target he encountered. Instead, he watched, analyzed the escort patterns, calculated ranges and angles, and waited for the moment when his boat's formidable diesel engines and electric motors could be positioned to maximum advantage. The first confirmed contact came on the 27th day of the patrol. A merchant vessel, identified through binoculars as a medium-sized British freighter, was traveling roughly parallel to U-564's position, but separated by several kilometers of empty ocean. The ship was escorted, but the escort arrangement was incomplete. A single corvette maintaining station, likely unaware that a predator was operating in the vicinity. Suren's decision-making process, at this moment, revealed both his caution and his tactical clarity. He could have launched a torpedo immediately, accepting the risk that the escort might detect the boat's position before U-564 could dive. Instead, he maneuvered the submarine to close the distance while remaining submerged, using the boat's superior underwater battery power to creep forward in the direction of his prey. This required patience, as the submarine could move only slowly, without creating turbulence that might be detected, and it required his crew to maintain absolute discipline. No unnecessary movements, no voices above a whisper, every man understanding that survival depended on remaining undetected. The passage of hours during such a stalk was psychologically grinding. The crew knew they were hunting, but they also knew they were the hunted, and the thin steel hull separated them from crushing water pressure and certain death. When the distance had closed sufficiently, Suhren ordered U-564 to rise to attack depth. The boat came up with silent precision, and Suhren pressed his eye to the periscope, taking the readings he needed: range, bearing, target speed, angle on the bow. His voice, when he issued firing orders, was completely composed. A single torpedo tube fired, its acoustic signature a moment of irrevocable commitment. The weapon drove through the water, and Suhren lowered the periscope, ordering the boat into a steep dive. Behind them, above them, the torpedo ran toward its target. "Seconds stretched!" Then came the distinct sound transmitted through U-564's hull, the sound of impact, of steel torn open, of a ship's structural integrity surrendering to explosion. The merchant vessel had been hit. The crew in U-564 exchanged glances that registered the primitive satisfaction of a successful hunt, but there was no cheering, no celebration. The corvette would be responding now, would be racing toward the position of the attack, and U-564 had minutes to put distance between herself and danger. The depth charge attack that followed was brutal in its impersonality. The corvette dropped charges along a search pattern, and each detonation was a shock transmitted through water to the submarine's hull, reverberating through the compartments, testing the structural integrity that separated the crew from death. The crew braced themselves against equipment, against bulkheads, their faces expressions of controlled fear. Suhren's orders were quick and decisive. Adjust trim, change course, reduce noise to absolute minimum. His demeanor in the face of this assault communicated to every man aboard that he had anticipated this outcome, that he had planned for it, and that he had confidence in both his boat and his crew's ability to survive it. The attack lasted roughly 40 minutes, though time operated strangely in a depth-charged submarine. Minutes became hours, and yet somehow hours compressed into minutes, because there was no external reference point, only the sounds of water, explosion, and the boat's systems struggling under stress. When the corvette finally gave up the search and withdrew, U-564 remained quiet, holding depth, letting the silence return around her. No man moved until Suhren himself came forward and confirmed that the immediate danger had passed. The successful conclusion of this engagement did something profound for Suhren standing aboard U-564. He had not attacked rashly. He had stalked with patience. He had executed a technically competent assault. He had survived the enemy's countermeasures with composure. These facts, simple as they were, filtered through the boat and transformed the men's understanding of who commanded them. Suhren was not a commander who would throw away their lives through recklessness or panic. Over the following weeks of patrol, U-564 encountered additional targets. Though not all attacks were successful, some merchant ships spotted the submarine and took evasive action. Some convoys had escort strengths that made attack inadvisable. Suhren's willingness to break off pursuits without having achieved a kill demonstrated a sophistication that contrasted sharply with some other U-boat captains, who sometimes became fixated on a single target and exposed themselves to unnecessary danger. The intelligence that would later reach Allied ears would reflect respect for Suhren's tactical judgment. He was not operating on intuition or aggression alone. but on a kind of calculating chess player's mentality, applied to the deadliest arena imaginable. By the time U-564 turned homeward in early May, the patrol had yielded measurable success. The boat's log recorded, confirmed sinkings and damage assessments that would be verified through intelligence sources back at U-boat headquarters. The tonnage sank under Suren's command during this patrol was not extraordinary compared to the greatest U-boat aces, but it was solid, and more importantly, it had been achieved without excessive risk-taking and without the loss of the boat or her crew. When U-564 returned to her home port, Suren's reputation had evolved. He was no longer simply a promising officer with intact nerves and command experience. He was a captain who had proven himself under fire, who had demonstrated both aggressive intent and tactical judgment, and who inspired genuine confidence in his crew. The men who had shipped out with caution had returned with a belief that they had the right man commanding them, the man most likely to return them alive while accomplishing the mission. This combination of factors, skill, confidence, and the demonstrated capacity to survive, transformed U-564 from a boat with mixed results into an instrument with clear purpose and direction. Reinhard Suhren had taken his first step toward becoming one of the most recognized names in the U-boat fleet, and the Atlantic War itself would not remain forgiving for much longer. By the middle of 1943, the Atlantic Ocean had become a vast, unforgiving arena where two navies fought an invisible war beneath and above the waves. Reinhard Suhren stood at the helm of U-564, a man in his late 20s, with the weight of command pressing against his shoulders every waking moment, and often invading his sleep. The year had begun with a paradox that few aboard could fully comprehend. The German U-boat fleet had never been larger, never been more confident, and yet never had the odds turned so decisively against them. The Allies possessed intelligence that German commanders could scarcely imagine, intercepting coded transmissions, triangulating positions, and reading the tactical intentions of the wolf packs with frightening accuracy. Suhren knew none of this. What he knew was that the sea itself had become more crowded, more hostile, more bristling with invisible threats. Every periscope observation revealed new escort vessels. Every radio signal crackled with warnings of aircraft departures and convoy positions. The men under his command felt it too, that electric current of heightened danger running through the steel corridors of U-564, a tension that no amount of routine or discipline could entirely suppress. When Suhren took U-564 into the Atlantic for what historians would later call his turning point patrol, the boat's complement was steady, trained, and increasingly experienced under his methodical tutelage. The crew had learned his habits, his preferences, his uncompromising standards for watchkeeping and mechanical readiness. Suhren demanded that every man understand not merely his own station, but the interconnected roles of all positions aboard the submarine. He believed that a captain was only as competent as his crew's collective knowledge and vigilance. During the transit through the Bay of Biscay, notoriously infested with Allied aircraft, U-564 moved with practiced caution, diving at the slightest hint of engine noise, remaining submerged for extended periods, while the world above hunted relentlessly. The cramped quarters of the submarine meant that tension lived in the very air the men breathed, recycled through the boat's systems, inseparable from the hum of electric motors and the creak of the pressure hull responding to the ocean's immense weight. Suhren remained calm throughout, moving through the boat with unhurried precision, checking instruments, observing his men, offering quiet corrections where needed. His example set the tone. If the captain remained composed, the crew could believe in survival. Once clear of the Bay of Biscay and into the open Atlantic, Suhren received the tactical intelligence that would guide his patrol, coordinates for expected convoy routes, estimated sailing dates, and the customary positions where merchant shipping gathered before making the dangerous dash eastbound toward Britain. The information came from the German Naval High Command's analysis of intercepted signals and pattern recognition, a system that had served the U-boat arm brilliantly for years, but was now increasingly unreliable due to Allied countermeasures that even Berlin's cryptanalysts had not fully grasped. Suhren studied the orders with the same methodical attention he brought to every aspect of his command, but he trusted his own instincts as much as any headquarters assessment. The sea, he believed, revealed its secrets to those patient and observant enough to read them. He positioned U-564 in what his experience suggested was a promising area, a stretch of the Atlantic where the convergence of shipping lanes and the limited reach of Allied escort aircraft created a window of opportunity. The boat ran partially submerged during daylight hours, presenting a minimal silhouette, her diesel engines shut down, her electric motors providing just enough propulsion to maintain station. The crew settled into the profound monotony of patrol, standing watch, maintaining equipment, sleeping when opportunities arose, eating the same tinned rations that sustained submariners across the entire German fleet. On the day contact was made, the lookouts atop the conning tower spotted the telltale smudge of smoke on the horizon, the unmistakable signature of a merchant convoy, likely escorted, but not yet visible from U-564's low vantage point. Suhren ordered an immediate approach at the highest safe surface speed, pushing the diesel engines to maximum output, accepting the risk that the exhaust smoke might betray his presence to distant escort vessels. The target was too valuable to ignore. Convoys carried the lifeblood of the Allied war effort: oil, grain, munitions, vehicles, and increasingly, American industrial production flowing toward British ports and beyond. Each ship represented not merely military supplies, but months of industrial labor and precious hull capacity diverted from other uses. For Suhren and his crew, a successful convoy attack meant validation of their training, proof of their worth within the U-boat hierarchy, and a tangible contribution to the strategic struggle. The men moved with purposeful efficiency through the boat, each checking the systems under their control, each acutely aware that the next few hours would determine whether they returned to base as successful hunters or as casualties in the grinding statistics of the Atlantic War. As the convoy grew larger on the horizon, Suhren's tactical instincts told him that a submerged approach would be too slow. The merchant ships and their escorts would pass beyond firing range before U-564 could maneuver into position. Instead, he made the aggressive decision to attack on the surface, accepting the elevated risk of detection in exchange for speed and maneuverability. This was the calculated boldness that increasingly distinguished Suhren from more cautious commanders. He understood the mathematics of risk and reward, the equation that weighed available options against the operational imperative to inflict damage on enemy shipping. U-564 surged forward across the surface, her deck gun crew standing by in readiness, the torpedo tubes forward and aft flooded, and the firing mechanisms armed. The escort vessels were not yet aware of the threat. The convoy was still at an oblique angle, presenting a profile that suggested the enemy had not yet spotted the submarine. These were the moments when the fog of war operated in both directions, when the hunter and hunted existed in a precarious balance, neither fully aware of the other's position or intentions. The first attack came with sudden, controlled violence. Suhren maneuvered U-564 to achieve an optimal firing angle, calculating the range, the convoy's speed and course, and the lead necessary for a successful intercept. When he gave the order to fire, torpedoes streaked through the Atlantic toward the merchant vessels, their wake lines visible only to those trained to recognize them. One struck home, tearing into a cargo vessel's hull with a violence that tore through steel and wood, spilling oil and debris across the water's surface. The stricken ship began to settle, her crew abandoning to lifeboats, while behind her, the convoy dissolved into chaos. Escort vessels wheeled about, seeking the attacker's position, their engines surging to maximum power. This was the moment of maximum danger for a submarine on the surface. The hunter had revealed itself, and now became the hunted, forced to choose between pressing the attack and diving to safety. Suhren ordered another firing solution, demonstrating the nerve that had earned him standing within the U-boat service, the willingness to accept risk in pursuit of military advantage. Additional torpedoes left U-564's tubes, and another vessel was damaged, struck squarely amidships, and beginning the slow, agonizing process of sinking deeper into the Atlantic. Around him, the sea erupted into a maelstrom of activity. Depth charges sent up by escorting destroyers, their underwater explosions creating walls of shock that shook U-564 violently, men thrown against bulkheads by the force of near misses, equipment ripping free from mounting brackets, the boat itself groaning under the punishment of detonations close enough to damage the hull. Suhren ordered an immediate dive, and U-564 slipped beneath the surface, just as the first waves of coordinated escort counterattacks commenced. The boat twisted and turned through the depths, her crew fighting to maintain control, to keep her on an even keel, to move with sufficient speed to distance herself from the escorts that hunted her with increasing desperation. Suhren remained composed, issuing orders in a steady voice. His years of training and his accumulated experience as a submarine captain manifesting in every tactical decision, every course adjustment, every decision about how much noise the boat could afford to generate before the hunters pinpointed her location. The pursuit continued for hours, an exhausting play of concealment and detection, danger and escape. Suhren took U-564 deep, below the thermocline, where temperature changes distorted sonar returns, banking on the physics of the ocean to shield his boat from the escort vessel's acoustic sensors. The men aboard endured the psychological torment of knowing that at any moment a depth charge might strike close enough to collapse the pressure hull, transforming the submarine from a weapon of war into a steel coffin. Yet Suhren's steady demeanor, his evident confidence in his own judgment, prevented panic from taking hold. He had created a command culture aboard U-564, where officers and enlisted men alike trusted their captain's decisions with a faith that transcended rational calculation. This was the intangible quality that separated the truly great submarine commanders from the competent ones. It was not merely technical skill, but an ability to project calm certainty in the face of mortal danger, to convince men that their lives rested in capable hands. By the time U-564 finally shook off her pursuers, the patrol had achieved what Suhren would report to flotilla headquarters as a significant success. 2 merchant vessels sunk, their cargo dispersed across the Atlantic floor, their crews rescued by escort vessels or left to the mercy of the ocean. The tonnage represented a meaningful contribution to the U-boat war effort, and the success would echo through the submarine service's informal networks, adding to Suhren's growing reputation. Officers at U-boat headquarters took note. Captains within the flotilla began to speak of Suhren with a mixture of respect and something approaching awe. Here was a commander who understood not merely the mechanics of submarine warfare, but its psychological and tactical dimensions, who could assess risk with precision and execute complex operations under the most extreme pressure. More importantly, perhaps, merchant sailors who survived attacks began to speak in hushed tones of U-564 and her captain. Tales passed between convoy escorts and merchant vessel captains of the aggressive, skillful German submarine that appeared without warning and struck with lethal accuracy. The name Suhren began to acquire a reputation that preceded U-564's arrival in any area. Enemy sailors who knew that name took additional precautions, called for stronger escorts, reported sightings to their commanding officers with heightened urgency. What neither Suhren nor any German submarine commander could perceive from beneath the ocean's surface was how completely the strategic picture had shifted, how the very success of operations like this patrol was buying time measured in months rather than years. The Allies were winning, though their victory was being purchased with thousands of merchant sailors' lives, with hulls sent to the bottom, with supplies burned and lost to the Atlantic's depths. The machine that Suhren served was a dying machine, though its death was not yet inevitable, and its final spasms would still extract an enormous price in blood and suffering. Suhren had earned his reputation as a dangerous opponent, a captain whose name appeared in enemy intelligence summaries and caused genuine concern among Allied naval planners. Yet that reputation was being built upon a foundation that was already crumbling, though Suhren and his peers could not yet admit it to themselves, could not yet reckon with the fact that individual brilliance was becoming progressively irrelevant against the overwhelming material and technological advantages that the Allies possessed. For now, for this moment, in the summer of 1943, Suhren was at the height of his powers, commanding a boat whose crew trusted him absolutely, operating in an arena where his skill still mattered and his boldness still yielded results. The Turning Point Patrol marked something important in Suhren's evolution as a commander, though not in the way he would have understood it. It proved that he had mastered the craft of submarine warfare, that he could execute complex operations under extreme stress, that his tactical instincts were sound and his nerve was unshakable. But it also represented the last full flowering of a moment in history when individual prowess could still shape events, when a single commander's skill could still influence the outcome of battles. Within months, the technologies and tactics available to the Allies would advance further still, and even captains of Suhren's exceptional ability would find their margin for success narrowing steadily, inexorably, until survival itself became the only victory worth mentioning. For now, though, his patrol stood as a symbol of German U-boat efficiency at its peak, a demonstration of why the Atlantic had belonged, however temporarily, to the men who served in those steel vessels and the commanders who led them into waters that offered no mercy and no quarter. In the spring of 1943, Reinhard Suhren stood in the conning tower of U-564 and made a choice that would remain with him for the rest of his life. The merchant vessel on the horizon was listing, its hull torn open by a torpedo that had struck amidships just moments before. Through the periscope, he could see lifeboats being launched, see men scrambling across the tilting deck, see the ocean claiming the ship's bow as it descended into the grey Atlantic. He ordered U-564 to surface. The tactical reasoning was sound. Surface attacks offered a greater chance of success against a convoy, and every successful engagement brought him closer to the tonnage that might earn him a promotion or a medal. But as the submarine rose from the depths and broke through the surface, spray cascading across the hull, Suhren was confronted by something that no training, no academy lecture, no operational manual had truly prepared him for. The merchant ship was dying, and he was watching it happen. The crew of the U-boat cheered. It was reflex, born from months of hunting and combat, from the necessity of maintaining morale and momentum. The sound jarred something in Suhren, a recognition that there was a gulf between the abstract concept of sinking vessels and the reality unfolding before him. He did not order them to silence, but he did not join their celebration either. He watched, and he felt the weight of it settling onto his shoulders, like ballast that would never be purged from the tanks. The merchant sailors in the lifeboats could see U-564 clearly now. For many of them, this would be their first glimpse of the enemy they had feared since leaving port. Not a distant abstraction, but a tangible steel shape crewed by men in grey uniforms. Suhren had learned, through reports and through the grim efficiency of modern warfare, that merchant vessels often carried more than cargo. They carried troops, they carried ammunition, they carried the supplies that would feed and arm the forces arrayed against Germany. But they also carried ordinary sailors who had signed aboard for wages, not for glory. Some of them had families waiting in Liverpool or Glasgow or New York. Some of them had never seen combat before and had volunteered or been conscripted into service because they believed it was their duty. Now those men were clinging to lifeboats in waters that barely reached 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the German submarine that had sent them there was holding position nearby, watching them struggle. The operational doctrine was clear on this point. U-boats were not rescue vessels. There was no requirement to render assistance, and doing so would risk the submarine to enemy forces. Suhren knew this. Every U-boat captain knew this. The Kriegsmarine had issued standing orders that prioritized the safety of the boat and the continuation of the patrol above all other considerations. Yet there was a gulf between what doctrine permitted and what a man of conscience had to confront when he saw the actual consequence of his actions. Suhren ordered U-564 to proceed. The boat pulled away from the sinking vessel, leaving the lifeboats and the struggling men behind. Over the following weeks and months, as U-564 continued her patrol through the Atlantic hunting corridor, Suhren began to understand something about warfare that transcended the technical mastery he had spent years developing. Every tonnage statistic that was recorded in his log represented not an abstract blow against the enemy's logistics, but a specific moment of catastrophe for specific human beings. A vessel carrying 5,000 tons of cargo had not simply ceased to exist. The crew had experienced those final moments as their ship tore itself apart, as the ocean poured through the breach in the hull, as the water rose and the air became toxic with steam and smoke and the sounds of their own fear. If the ship went down quickly, it was a mercy of sorts, but many ships lingered, breaking apart slowly, giving the crew time to realize that they were drowning, that all their years of life had led to this particular moment in this particular stretch of cold water. Suhren had trained himself not to think about these specifics, to see warfare as an enterprise of strategy and tactics, and tonnage sunk. The training had worked well. It had allowed him to give orders without hesitation, to press attacks when hesitation might have cost him success, to maintain the cold calculation that submarine warfare demanded. But the training could not erase what he had witnessed, could not prevent his mind from returning to those images during quiet moments, when the boat was running silent and there was nothing to do but think. The records show that during his patrols commanding U-564, Suhren's attacks resulted in the sinking of roughly 60,000 tons of merchant shipping. This was a significant achievement within the U-boat arm, enough to earn him recognition and consideration for higher command. The tonnage represented dozens of vessels, tankers and freighters, refrigerated ships carrying meat and dairy, ammunition ships, transport vessels loaded with military equipment, cargo vessels packed with supplies that would have reached Africa or the Middle East or Europe had they survived. Each of these ships had a name, a registry, a crew manifest. Each of them had owners in Liverpool or Hamburg or Stockholm who learned that their vessel had been lost. Each of them carried human beings who had been going about their ordinary lives, standing watch, playing cards in the crew quarters, writing letters home, worrying about when they would see their families again, when the torpedo struck. Some of the crews were lucky. They made it to the lifeboats and were picked up by escort vessels or by other merchant ships that had witnessed the attack. They survived, though many of them bore the trauma of that survival for the rest of their lives. Others were not so fortunate. They went down with their ships, or they died of exposure in the lifeboats, or they were pulled from the water in such poor condition that they did not recover. The historical record does not capture every individual death, does not record every name or every story. It simply accumulates tonnage. 60,000 tons, measured in ships destroyed, translated into statistics in logbooks and official reports. Suhren was not a man inclined toward excessive introspection. That much is clear from the fragments of his personal correspondence and the accounts of his officers and crew. He was a professional officer who understood that his primary obligation was to the performance of his duties and the survival of his boat and crew. When he gave an order to attack, it was based on tactical assessment. This vessel is carrying supplies that will strengthen the enemy. Therefore, this vessel must be sunk. The logic was compelling and operationally sound. Germany was in a life-or-death struggle for survival, and the Atlantic was one of the critical theaters of that struggle. Every ton of supplies that was prevented from reaching British ports was a ton that could not feed the British population or supply British forces. From this perspective, Suhren's actions were not crimes. They were contributions to the German war effort at a moment when that effort required everything that every officer could give. Yet this reasoning, however logically sound, coexisted with something else in Suhren's consciousness. It coexisted with the memory of those lifeboats, with the knowledge that among the 60,000 tons of cargo, there had been thousands of human beings, with the understanding that some of those human beings had been civilians or had become casualties of warfare without ever having been combatants themselves. This was not a contradiction that Suhren tried to resolve through argument or rationalization. Rather, it seems that he carried both things simultaneously: the professional commitment to the mission and the human awareness of its cost. This capacity for both things at once is perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of his character to understand, because it refuses easy moral categorization. The Atlantic in 1943 and 1944 was a world of suffering that extended far beyond the submarines and their crews. The merchant sailors who crewed the convoys were among the most vulnerable populations in the entire war. They had not received formal military training in most cases. They were civilian employees of shipping companies who found themselves in what amounted to a shooting gallery. The casualty rates among merchant marines were staggering. Estimates suggest that 1 in 3 merchant sailors was killed during the war. This compared unfavorably even to the casualty rates among U-boat crews, who at least had the advantage of knowing they were aboard combat vessels. The merchant sailors simply went to work, did their jobs, and hoped that their vessel would not be targeted. Many of them died hoping. The convoys themselves became the focus of enormous strategic attention. The Allies understood that their entire prosecution of the war depended on the ability to move supplies across the Atlantic, and they committed enormous resources to protecting those supplies. The Luftwaffe, frustrated by Allied air superiority over land, threw dive bombers and torpedo bombers and conventional bombers at the convoys from the air. The U-boats attacked from beneath the surface. Surface raiders and armed merchant cruisers attacked when they could find the convoys, and the escort vessels, destroyers and corvettes and minesweepers, pressed into service as anti-submarine warships, fought back with depth charges and ramming tactics and gunfire, trying to protect the convoy at any cost. The ocean became a place of intense violence, and the men who died there died for abstract concepts like supply lines and logistics and the strategic equation of the war. Suhren never lost sight of the fact that this violence was his responsibility to perpetrate. He was the one pulling the trigger, metaphorically speaking. He was the one deciding where the torpedoes would go. By the middle of 1943, the tonnage sunk by individual U-boat commanders had become something close to a measure of professional success within the Kriegsmarine. The Navy kept meticulous records, and officers with the highest tonnage achieved a kind of celebrity status within the service. They were invited to address other captains, were held up as examples of tactical excellence, were considered candidates for promotion to flotilla command, or even to positions within the Naval High Command. Suhren was accumulating tonnage at a respectable rate, and he was aware that this was improving his prospects within the service. Some officers embraced this competition enthusiastically, pursuing tonnage with an almost obsessive intensity, allowing the measure to define their professional identity. Suhren seems to have been more ambivalent. He wanted to perform well. He wanted the recognition that came with success. But he also seems to have understood, at some level, what the tonnage actually represented. The recognition that came with sinking 60,000 tons of merchant shipping was recognition for having made a certain number of human beings cease to exist. It was recognition for being efficient at the business of death. Suhren accepted the recognition because in the context of wartime service, this was what was offered and what was expected. But there is a quality of reserve in the historical record surrounding Suhren's attitude toward his achievements, a sense that he may have been uncomfortable with the enthusiasm with which his accomplishments were celebrated. The moral burden of command becomes most visible in the quiet moments that punctuate military service. Between patrols, Suhren would return to port, and U-564 would be refitted and resupplied and prepared for the next mission into the Atlantic. During these periods, there was time for reflection, though not necessarily for rest. The knowledge that more tonnage awaited, that the next patrol would bring more sinkings and more merchant sailors dying in the cold Atlantic, was always present. There were letters to write, there were reports to file, there were crew members whose morale had to be maintained, who had to be prepared to go back out and kill again, and risk being killed themselves. There were the practical demands of leadership in a submarine, where a crew of roughly 45 to 50 men lived in conditions of extraordinary closeness and discomfort, where tensions could fracture a boat's cohesion, if not carefully managed, where the commander bore the ultimate responsibility, not just for tactical success, but for the welfare and psychological state of every man under his command. Suhren appears to have been a demanding captain, exacting high standards of professionalism and discipline. The crew of U-564 was said to be one of the better trained and more effective crews in the U-boat service, a reputation that did not come from lenience or from allowing standards to slip. Yet there is also evidence that Suhren was respected by his crew, that they understood his demands came from a commitment to excellence and to the survival of the boat and its men. This was the paradox of Suhren's command. He was a hard captain who drove his men to achieve results that translated into the deaths of enemy sailors and civilians. Yet his demands on his crew came from a place of genuine concern for their welfare, from a belief that the only way to protect his men was to make them the best at what they did. If U-564 was the most effective hunting machine, then U-564 was more likely to survive. If the boat was the most tactically sound, then the men aboard it were less likely to be depth-charged into oblivion. The logic was internal, and it was not incorrect, but it was also a logic that required constant engagement in the business of killing. The voices of the merchant sailors themselves provide a crucial counterpoint to the strategic narratives that surround the Battle of the Atlantic. The survivors who made it back to port, who spent weeks or months recovering in hospitals, who eventually returned to civilian life and lived long enough to tell their stories to historians and documentarians. These men remembered with absolute clarity what it felt like to have their ship sunk beneath them. They remembered the shock of the explosion, the chaos of abandonment, the desperate scramble for lifeboats, the cold that seemed to possess a physical quality, the fear that rescue might not come. Some of them remembered watching their shipmates die, remembered the moment when a man's grip on the life raft weakened, and he slipped into the water and was gone. These experiences left scars, psychological and sometimes physical, that persisted for decades. Many merchant sailors never returned to the sea after their first sinking. The psychological toll was simply too great. Others went back because they had no other choice, because they were skilled seamen without other employment prospects, because the war still needed to be prosecuted. These men became targets again, and some of them were sunk multiple times, surviving several torpedoings before they were finally left to live their remaining years on land. The fact that Suhren never met these survivors, never heard these stories in any detailed way, is historically significant. His knowledge of the consequences of his actions was mediated through reports and statistics, and the occasional glimpse through the periscope. He knew that people were dying, but he did not know them as individuals, did not hear their voices or their stories. This separation between the actor and the consequences of the action is one of the mechanisms by which warfare at a distance becomes psychologically tolerable. Yet Suhren's own records and the testimonies of his officers suggest that this separation was never complete, that some part of him was aware of the costs in ways that extended beyond the abstract categories of naval warfare. The merchant vessel that sank quickly was, in Suhren's operational thinking, a Bunz. By 1943, the Atlantic had become unrecognizable to the men who hunted beneath its surface. The early war, when U-boat commanders could surface at will and pick apart merchant convoys with almost mechanical ease, had vanished into memory. The enemy had learned. They had adapted faster than anyone in Berlin had anticipated, and they had brought to bear technologies that transformed the hunter into the hunted. Reinhard Suhren understood this shift not as a theoretical problem presented in some headquarters briefing, but as a lived experience, a series of near-death moments that accumulated like frost on the periscope lens. Each patrol taught him that the methods that had worked 6 months prior were now a recipe for disaster. The wolf pack tactics that had devastated Allied shipping in the previous year were yielding to coordinated escort groups equipped with instruments that could detect a submerged U-boat from distances that seemed to defy the laws of physics themselves. Suhren was now commanding not just a boat, but a vessel that required constant reinvention to survive. The core of his tactical evolution lay in understanding the enemy's capabilities without ever seeing them directly. Allied radar sets had become extraordinarily sophisticated. The 10th Flotilla's attack convoys now carried sets mounted on their escort vessels and flying boats, allowing them to detect U-boat conning towers at ranges of several kilometers, even in darkness. This meant that the night surface attack, which had been the foundation of German U-boat doctrine, was no longer a path to advantage, but a path to ambush. Suhren digested this reality and began adjusting his approach methodically. He studied the patterns of the convoys themselves, their course changes, their timing, the behavior of individual escort ships, the way a musician might study an opponent's breathing. He began to trust his crew's ability to interpret the faint sounds transmitted through hydrophones, the ping of sonar that echoed through the steel hull, like a hunter's call growing closer with each ping. He experimented with submerged daylight attacks, a tactic that required absolute precision in depth control and an almost preternatural sense of where an enemy ship would be when his torpedoes arrived at their calculated interception point. Deception became Suhren's philosophical partner during these months of transformation. If he could not rely on surprise, he would create false expectations. He began to study the behavior of the escort commanders themselves, their predictable responses to contact reports, their tendency to concentrate around the threatened convoy rather than ranging far ahead in search of the killer below. Suhren would sometimes break contact intentionally, allowing the escorts to believe they had driven him away, only to circle wide and approach from an unexpected bearing, while the enemy's attention remained focused elsewhere. This demanded extraordinary patience from a man commanding a vessel with limited fuel and a crew growing progressively more exhausted by the constant tension of operational patrols. His written standing orders to his officers began to emphasize waiting, watching, and recognizing the precise moment when the odds shifted sufficiently to warrant an attack. The old aggressive spirit remained. He was no cautious tactician, but it was tempered now by calculation. The physical aspects of submarine command also demanded innovation. As the enemy's acoustic technology improved, U-564's diesel engines, which had once rumbled through the Atlantic with relative impunity, now became liabilities. Every revolution of the screw was another voice calling out to the Allied listening apparatus. Suhren worked with his engineering officer to develop protocols for ultra-quiet running, reducing speed to bare steerage way, cycling through the electric motors at minimum output, avoiding any sudden maneuvers that would create acoustic signatures that would spike on the enemy sonar screen. These measures exacted a cost. They reduced tactical flexibility and made escape more difficult if discovery came suddenly. But they offered something precious, the chance to remain undetected long enough to deliver an attack. On several patrols in the latter months of 1943, U-564 remained submerged for days at a time, her crew moving about the boat in near silence, communicating through hand signals and whispered instructions, waiting in the darkness for their opportunity. Suhren's innovation extended to weaponry as well. The standard acoustic homing torpedoes that the Germans had begun deploying in limited numbers offered tremendous tactical promise. They could track the sound of an escort ship's propellers, following the quarry with a precision that no contact-fused weapon could achieve. But these weapons were expensive, unreliable, and available in frustratingly small numbers. Suhren learned through bitter experience and careful debriefing of his junior officers how to position his boat to maximize the effectiveness of his mixed armament. He might use a conventional torpedo against the primary target, a large merchant vessel at the center of the convoy, while reserving his acoustic weapons for the escorts, whose destruction would break the protective cordon and expose the merchantmen to follow-up attacks. This required multiple firings across successive surfacings, a prolonged engagement that increased the danger of detection, but offered the possibility of inflicting significantly greater damage than a single quick attack. The relationship between Suhren and his crew deepened during these months of constant tactical adjustment. His men had signed on to a U-boat, with the understanding that they were elite warriors, that their captain knew the game, and would not ask them to make meaningless sacrifices. As the war turned, and survival itself became the primary objective, Suhren's reputation for clear thinking became more valuable than ever. He did not inspire loyalty through bombast or Nazi ideology. There is no evidence that Suhren was a particular ideologue, but rather through the simple reality that his decisions kept them alive. The crew of U-564 understood that their captain was thinking faster than the enemy, that he was learning from each patrol and evolving his methods. This trust became the third torpedo tube, the invisible weapon that multiplied the effectiveness of the physical armament. Men who trusted their captain would push the boat to its operational limits. They would maintain discipline during hours of depth charge attacks, when panic would be more natural than precision. They would risk their lives in the hope that Suren's next innovation would yield another success. Training became increasingly systematic as Suren matured as a commander. Rather than relying on instinct or institutional knowledge passed down through the flotilla, he began to run tactical drills during surface transits, working through hypothetical scenarios with his junior officers. What would you do if the convoy turned north at this bearing? What if the elite escort detected us at this range? He created a shared understanding of his tactical philosophy, so that even if he were incapacitated during an action, his first watch officer could execute a plan that reflected the captain's intentions. This distributed knowledge also created redundancy. If Suren became fixated on one approach, his officers might suggest alternatives, and the best idea would prevail regardless of rank. This was not the rigid hierarchy of German military tradition, but a pragmatic acknowledgement that survival required collective intelligence, not the pronouncements of a single brilliant commander. As 1944 arrived, Suren's tactical framework became even more sophisticated. The Allies had introduced new convoy routing procedures, new escort formations, and new weapons. The U-boats were being equipped with snorkel apparatus that allowed them to run their diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, a tremendously useful capability, but one that still generated acoustic signatures that the enemy could detect. Suren experimented with snorkel running at different engine speeds, trying to find a rhythm that would allow him to charge his batteries while remaining effectively invisible. He studied the patterns of Allied air patrols, the routes they flew, the gaps in their coverage where a U-boat might surface and run for brief periods. Every decision involved trade-offs. Greater speed meant greater acoustic signature. Longer underwater endurance meant slower movement through the patrol area. Aggressive attack profiles meant higher risk of counterattack. The documentary record of Suren's patrols during the latter half of 1943 and into 1944 reveals a commander who was constantly pushing at the boundaries of the possible. He would attempt surface attacks in broad daylight when the enemy's radar should have detected him, but would time the approach so that he surfaced precisely at the moment when an escort ship's attention was diverted elsewhere. He would conduct submerged attacks from angles that the traditional doctrine would have suggested were impossible, exploiting the acoustic environment to conceal his approach. He experimented with feints and false contacts, using decoys and deliberate noise-making to distract escorts while his boat maneuvered into a firing position. None of these techniques represented a revolution in submarine warfare. The principles had existed in latent form within German naval thinking, but Suren was synthesizing them into a coherent system, a philosophy of combat that acknowledged the enemy's advantages while refusing to accept defeat as inevitable. Yet there was something almost melancholic about these innovations, a sense that brilliance itself was becoming irrelevant. The tonnage sunk under Suren's command during 1943 and into 1944 represented significant achievements by any measure, but the broader picture was becoming inescapable. For every merchant ship destroyed, the Allies replaced it within weeks. For every escort damaged, they brought 3 more across the Atlantic. The innovation that allowed Suren to survive a patrol and sink a vessel was matched by innovations on the enemy side that made the next patrol exponentially more dangerous. The game had become one in which the best player in the world would eventually be checkmated, simply because the opponent had infinite pieces and infinite time. Suren's tactical brilliance could delay the inevitable, but it could not prevent it. He knew this, and his crew knew it, but they continued to innovate anyway. Not because they believed they could win, but because innovation was the only thing that might keep them alive for one more patrol. The relationship Suhren formed with other U-boat commanders also influenced his evolving tactical doctrine. The flotilla system meant that German U-boats operated in relative isolation from one another, but they were bound together by wireless communication and the monthly intelligence summaries that circulated among the command structure. Suhren absorbed lessons from other captains, some successful, others who had not returned. He corresponded with other commanding officers about the enemy's apparent patterns, about new weapons and tactics that seemed to be effective. This informal network of shared experience was incredibly valuable, a distributed learning system that functioned despite the technological limitations of the era. A captain in the North Atlantic would discover that a particular evasion maneuver was effective, and within weeks that knowledge would spread to boats operating in the Mediterranean and off the American coast. Suhren was both a consumer and a generator of this knowledge, a man who learned constantly and taught when the opportunity arose. The ultimate irony of Suhren's period of greatest tactical innovation was that it coincided with the period when German strategic defeat had become mathematically certain. The resources necessary to replace damaged U-boats, to build new vessels, to maintain the training pipeline of skilled submariners and officers, all of these were slipping away as Germany's industrial capacity was consumed by the demands of fighting a continental war, in addition to the naval war in the Atlantic. Suhren could sink merchant ships and damage escorts. He could survive patrols that should have killed him. He could innovate faster than the enemy could adapt. But he could not change the fact that Germany was losing the war at a pace that no individual commander, however brilliant, could arrest. And yet he continued to refine his methods, to train his crew, to push the boundaries of what his boat could accomplish. This was not stubbornness or delusion, but rather the commitment of a professional warrior to his craft, a man who had accepted that the outcome was beyond his control, but who would not allow that acceptance to diminish his effort. The evolution of Suhren's tactical thinking during these months represented both the apotheosis of German U-boat command and its ultimate tragedy, perfect technique in service of a cause that was already lost. The Atlantic in 1943 was no longer a hunting ground. It had become a graveyard. Reinhard Suhren understood this truth with the clarity that only a man who lived beneath the waves could possess. U-564 had survived longer than most submarines of her class, but survival was not the same as safety, and each patrol brought fresh evidence that the ocean was closing in. The Allies had begun to master the science of finding and killing submarines, with a precision that bordered on supernatural. Radar sets mounted on escort vessels could now detect a surfaced U-boat from distances that seemed impossible, and coordinated wolf packs, once the U-boat arm's greatest advantage, had become death sentences, as Allied aircraft and destroyers converged on radio intercepts to annihilate German boats before they could fire a shot. Suhren's genius as a captain lay not only in his ability to sink ships, but in his refusal to accept that odds were immutable facts rather than problems to be solved. Yet even a man of his talents could not bend the laws of physics or convince depth charges to miss through force of will alone. What unfolded across 1943 and into 1944 was a series of near-apocalyptic encounters that would test both his seamanship and his crew's nerve to the absolute breaking point. The first such brush with annihilation came during a routine patrol in the winter of 1943, when U-564 was operating in waters roughly northwest of Ireland. Suhren had received intelligence that a convoy was approaching, and he maneuvered to intercept, surfacing at dawn to gain speed and position. What he did not know was that an Allied escort group had already detected the presence of U-boats in the area and had adjusted their patrol patterns accordingly. Within minutes of surfacing, lookouts aboard a nearby British corvette spotted the submarine's conning tower, breaking the grey-green surface. The corvette's captain made an instant decision. Rather than report and wait for air support, he would ram the German boat before it could dive. Suhren saw the escort vessel bearing down on him and immediately ordered a crash dive. But the maneuver took precious seconds. Seconds that nearly cost U-564 her existence. The corvette's prow struck the submarine's starboard side with a grinding, screaming impact that threw men from their feet and sent a shock through the hull that lasted for what felt like an eternity. Had the collision occurred just slightly differently, it would have ruptured the pressure hull and sent the boat to the bottom with all hands. As it was, U-564 sustained damage to her outer hull and superstructure, but the inner hull held. Suhren pushed the submarine down to 150 meters, deeper than was strictly safe, hoping the escort vessel's depth-sensing equipment would lose track of him in the murk below. What followed was not a single attack, but a sustained assault that lasted for more than 6 hours. The corvette, joined by additional escort ships that responded to radio calls, conducted a methodical depth charge barrage against the submarine's position. The acoustic environment inside U-564 during such attacks was something no training manual could adequately prepare a man to endure. When a depth charge detonated, the concussive force transmitted through the water created a noise that was not merely loud, but seemed to come from inside the submarine itself, as if the ocean itself was trying to tear the boat apart from within. Light bulbs shattered. The entire crew felt a sickening pressure in their ears and heads. Equipment fell from racks. Men pressed their hands over their ears, though this provided no protection whatsoever. Suhren remained in the control room, calm and methodical, adjusting trim, listening to the sonar operator's whispered updates, and constantly recalculating whether the submarine's diminishing battery power would last long enough for darkness to fall and allow a surface escape. The attacks came in waves, with periods of terrible silence, interrupted by the rumbling approach of the escort ship's propellers, followed by the distinctive shriek of the thrower mechanisms launching depth charges, and then the cataclysmic explosions that seemed to compress the entire world into a ball of fire and violence. Around him, his men remained at their stations, trusting that their captain's decisions would see them through. It was this trust that kept Suhren functioning when the weight of responsibility might have broken a lesser officer. When darkness finally came, and the Allies could no longer see well enough to attack with precision, Suhren ordered the boat to surface. U-564 limped away on diesel engines, but she remained afloat, and her crew remained alive. As 1943 progressed into its darker months, such encounters became almost routine, though the word routine was grotesque when applied to nearly dying. There were ramming attempts in the English Channel in October, when a British minesweeper deliberately tried to drive U-564 beneath the waves. There were aerial attacks off the coast of France, where Suhren attempted to use his anti-aircraft armament to fight off Sunderland flying boats, each pass of the aircraft raking the submarine with machine gun fire. There was an encounter with an American destroyer escort that nearly caught U-564 on the surface, forcing a crash dive that took the submarine to depths she was not rated to safely operate at. The hull groaning and complaining under the water pressure, while the crew held their breath and waited to learn whether they would surface again or be crushed like an insect beneath a heel. Each of these episodes was separated by intervals of relative calm, patrols where Suhren managed to sink merchant ships or even a smaller warship and return to his base with battle flags flying. But the price was becoming impossible to ignore. Ships that had survived previous patrols were damaged beyond safe repair. Men who had survived multiple attacks were showing signs of psychological strain that no amount of discipline or ideology could overcome. The human mind, Suhren discovered, was not designed to face death repeatedly, without consequence. Some men developed tremors. Others became curiously detached, as if they had already accepted their fate and were simply waiting for reality to catch up. A few suffered complete nervous collapse, and Suhren, with the pragmatism that defined his character, arranged for them to be transferred to shore duties, where they might recover, or, more likely, remain in a state of perpetual haunting. The bond between Suhren and his crew, already strong before these trials, became something almost transcendent through shared ordeal. In the confined space of a submarine, every man knew that the captain's decisions determined whether they lived. Suhren made these decisions constantly, hundreds of small choices that cumulatively meant the difference between survival and the bottom of the Atlantic. His crew understood that he was not reckless, not driven by ideology or a desire for personal glory, but guided by a cold calculation of the boat's capabilities and the enemy's patterns. When Suhren ordered a crash dive with a particular angle or depth, his men executed the maneuver with absolute precision because they trusted that he had calculated correctly. When he decided to surface in what appeared to be dangerous circumstances, they believed he had seen something in the tactical situation that justified the risk. This trust became mutual. Suhren came to depend absolutely on his crew's competence, and he made it clear, through both word and action, that he valued them. He ensured they received the best food available, organized their liberty time to provide relief from the constant tension, and never asked them to undertake any risk that he himself would not have taken. The crew, in turn, performed their duties with a level of technical excellence that was noted even by other U-boat captains, and they followed Suhren with a loyalty that transcended the normal military hierarchies. By 1944, the nature of U-564's patrols had shifted fundamentally. The vast convoys that once provided hunting opportunities across the Atlantic were increasingly being routed north, around Iceland, or rerouted to the Mediterranean, where they were theoretically safer. Suhren found himself operating in waters that were more heavily defended, with fewer targets and more hunters. The U-boat arm was being systematically destroyed, not through dramatic fleet engagements, but through the grinding attrition of submarines being hunted down one by one and sent to the bottom. Suhren was aware of the statistics. The German Naval Command circulated reports on U-boat losses, though these reports were often incomplete or arrived weeks after the actual sinkings. In the first quarter of 1944 alone, German U-boats' losses reached catastrophic levels, and the tonnage of merchant shipping sunk per U-boat deployed had fallen to a fraction of the figures achieved just months earlier. And yet U-564 continued to survive, continued to inflict damage, continued to return to her base with evidence of successful operations. This was not luck, though luck surely played a role in any submarine's survival. It was the product of Suhren's accumulated expertise, his ability to read tactical situations with almost uncanny accuracy, and his willingness to take calculated risks that other captains would have rejected as suicidal. One particular patrol in the spring of 1944 encapsulates the nature of these encounters with destiny. U-564 was operating in the Bay of Biscay, an area that had become increasingly dangerous as the Allies established air bases along the coast of liberated France and Normandy. The U-boat had successfully attacked a convoy and was attempting to reach open water where she might evade the inevitable response. Suhren was on the bridge, scanning the horizon, when a lookout reported an aircraft bearing down from the northeast. It was a Liberator heavy bomber, a 4-engined aircraft capable of carrying depth charges and equipped with radar and sophisticated bombing systems. A direct hit from aerial depth charges would surely be fatal. Suhren had seconds to make a decision: dive and risk being pinned down in shallow water where the aircraft could hammer him methodically, or attempt to fight, using the submarine's anti-aircraft guns to drive off or damage the attacker. He ordered the crew to action stations and manned the guns. U-564's anti-aircraft armament was modest: 2 20mm cannons and some machine guns. But in the hands of well-trained crews, these weapons could put up a surprising amount of fire. As the Liberator made its bombing run, traces from U-564's guns streaked upward into the grey Atlantic sky. The aircraft pilot, seeing that the U-boat was defending itself rather than diving, adjusted his approach, but the U-boat's fire was sufficiently accurate to disrupt his bombing run. The Liberator released its depth charges, but the bombs fell wide, creating spectacular fountains of white water that seemed almost beautiful in their terrible symmetry. The aircraft climbed away, damaged, and choosing not to press the attack further. U-564 turned to run, reaching open water where aircraft could not easily track her submerged position. These encounters had another effect beyond the immediate tactical lessons they provided. They began to establish a reputation for U-564 that spread both among German U-boat officers and, more importantly, among the Allied naval personnel and merchant sailors who faced her in combat. Her name, or rather, her pennant number, which served as her identity in Allied intelligence reports, began to appear in Admiralty bulletins and convoy reports. Allied captains knew they were dealing with a boat that had evaded multiple attacks, that had sunk more tonnage than the statistical average, and that was commanded by an officer whose name began to circulate in intelligence circles as representing a particular caliber of threat. This reputation brought its own dangers. Knowing that a specific U-boat and captain was operating in a given area, the Allies would commit additional resources to finding and destroying it. Convoys would be rerouted to avoid the waters where U-564 was believed to be operating. Aircraft would conduct additional patrols. Warships would extend their search patterns. Suhren was aware of this consequence of his success, and it provided a grim irony. The more effective he became, the more resources arrayed against him, and the more slender the margin between survival and destruction became. As the year 1944 progressed, and the strategic situation continued to deteriorate for Germany, Suhren found himself commanding a submarine that represented a kind of paradox. U-564 remained technically sound and fully capable of sinking ships and damaging warships. Her crew had become a finely honed instrument of submarine warfare, their skills approaching the level of perfection that only thousands of hours of training and actual combat could achieve. But the ocean itself had changed. The Atlantic was no longer a place where a brave captain and a competent crew could expect to survive through merit alone. The Allies possessed such overwhelming advantages in technology, numbers, intelligence, and air power that even the most brilliant tactical maneuver could only postpone the inevitable. Suhren understood this with a clarity that many of his superiors in the German naval command seemed unwilling to acknowledge. The U-boat war, as a strategic system, had failed. Individual boats might still achieve tactical successes, but these successes could not alter the fundamental reality that Germany was losing the war at sea. And yet, because this was war, and because his men looked to him for leadership, Suhren continued to patrol, to hunt, to take risks, and to fight his way through encounters that by all reasonable calculation should have killed him and his crew numerous times over. The most significant aspect of these repeated brushes with annihilation was the evolution they created in the relationship between Suhren and the men under his command. Shared trauma, repeated together and survived together, created bonds that transcended normal military discipline or the ideological frameworks that supposedly motivated German officers. These men had faced death together dozens of times, and they had survived because their captain's decisions were sound and because they executed those decisions with flawless technical precision. There was no room in this equation for ideology or propaganda. There was only the practical reality of submarine warfare at its most elemental level, the captain's decisions, the crew's execution, and the ocean's indifference to either bravery or righteousness. Suhren treated his men with a respect that went beyond the formal courtesies of military rank. He knew their names, their families' circumstances, their individual strengths and weaknesses as submariners. He pushed them to the absolute limit of their capabilities, but never beyond the point where a man could no longer function effectively. And he accepted without complaint or criticism that some men, after surviving multiple depth charge attacks and ramming attempts, would reach a breaking point where they could no longer serve aboard a submarine with psychological and physical effectiveness. The U-564's crew reciprocated this respect with a loyalty that approached the mythic. By late 1944, U-564 had survived encounters with destiny that should have killed her a dozen times over. The submarine bore the marks of these battles in her scarred hull and the patches welded over damage that had been too severe to repair properly. Her crew bore the marks in a different way, in their faces, which had aged beyond their front. The year 1944 opened with a grim calculus that no amount of will or tactical brilliance could reverse. Across the Atlantic, Reinhard Suhren understood what his superiors in Berlin were only beginning to admit. The war at sea had fundamentally transformed. The hunters were becoming the hunted. Where once U-boats had roamed the convoy lanes with relative impunity, conducting their grim business under the cover of darkness and stormy weather, they now faced an enemy that owned the daylight, controlled the skies, and possessed intelligence capabilities that made secrecy nearly impossible. The Allies had cracked the German naval codes, a secret that would not be fully revealed until decades after the war ended. Every order radioed to a U-boat at sea was, in essence, being read by British and American commanders who could position their hunting groups with almost supernatural precision. For Suhren, this meant that every patrol into the Atlantic was now a desperate gamble, a venture into waters where the odds of return were deteriorating with each passing month. The strategic situation had tilted catastrophically in the months before 1944 arrived. The invasion of Normandy was coming. This much German intelligence knew with certainty, though the exact date and location remained shrouded in uncertainty. The Allies were gathering ships, men, and supplies on an unimaginable scale across the southern coast of England. Every convoy that reached British ports, every supply ship that crossed the Atlantic and delivered its cargo intact, strengthened the Allies' capacity to launch their assault. This gave German U-boat operations a desperate new urgency. Even as Hitler and the German High Command clung to fantasies of new wonder weapons and miraculous victories, the men in the submarines knew the truth. They were running out of time. The window of opportunity, if it had ever truly existed, was slamming shut. Suhren had spent the previous 2 years learning to kill efficiently in an environment that tested every human capability. Now he faced a different kind of test: how to survive in a war he could not win. The transformation of the Atlantic into a grave for U-boats had accelerated dramatically by early 1944. Statistics tell part of the story, but they mask the reality that Suhren and his fellow captains confronted every time they took their boats to sea. In 1943, Germany's U-boat fleet had sunk over 6 million tons of Allied shipping, a staggering figure that seemed to promise eventual strangling of Britain's lifeline. Yet, in that same year, the Allies had sunk more than 120 U-boats, a loss rate that no navy could sustain indefinitely. The mathematics were unforgiving. Germany was building submarines faster than peacetime, but the Allies were building escorts faster than Germany could build boats. The ratio of hunters to prey had inverted. Whereas a single U-boat might once have stalked a convoy for days, attacking and escaping into the vastness of the ocean, now every submarine faced screens of destroyers, frigates, and corvettes, armed with depth charges, hedgehogs, and the terrifying new weapon called the ahead-throwing charge. Aircraft patrolled the skies above, equipped with radars that could detect a U-boat on the surface at distances measured in kilometers. There was nowhere left to hide. Suhren's patrols in the early months of 1944 reflected this grim new reality with perfect clarity. The abundant play of targets that had characterized the previous years was evaporating. Convoys were fewer and farther between, or when they were found, they were so heavily escorted that attacking them meant accepting almost certain death. The merchant ships themselves had become a rare sight compared to the density of Allied warships protecting the sea lanes. Suhren's crew would spend days submerged, conserving battery power, listening to the ping of sonar sweeping across their hull, like fingers searching through darkness for something to crush. When they surfaced at night to recharge their batteries and hunt for targets, they were never certain whether the darkness concealed friend or enemy, whether the ship on the horizon was a merchant vessel worth the risk, or an armed trawler that would call down destruction upon them. The psychological strain on U-boat crews had become almost as deadly as the enemy's weapons. Men who had once bragged about their conquests now faced the grinding terror of knowing that each patrol might be their last, that the odds had shifted so completely that luck mattered more than skill. The approaches to the American coast, where Suhren and other U-boat captains sought to strike at targets before they could join Atlantic convoys, had become increasingly dangerous. The United States Navy had finally concentrated sufficient resources to make these waters genuinely hostile. Coastal shipping lanes that U-boats had once dominated with ease, claiming victims in a steady stream, were now patrolled with such intensity that surfacing at all meant accepting a high probability of detection. Yet staying submerged meant missing opportunities. The fundamental contradiction of submarine warfare had always been this: you could hide beneath the ocean's surface, but you could not hunt while hidden. To attack, a U-boat had to expose itself, had to break the surface, or come close enough to it that a keen observer might spot the thin line of a periscope or the disturbance of a torpedo wake. The Allies had learned to exploit this contradiction ruthlessly. They seeded their shipping lanes with decoys, with dummy vessels piloted by volunteer crews who would radio their position, calling U-boats into ambushes where destroyers waited with their crews at action stations. More than once, a captain who thought he had found an easy victim discovered instead that he had blundered into a trap designed specifically to kill him. By early 1944, Suhren found himself operating in an environment that demanded not just tactical brilliance, but a kind of acceptance of meaninglessness that was psychologically corrosive. Months at sea yielded nothing. Patrols that should have been rich with targets returned with empty torpedo racks and empty logbooks. The boats that ventured out never came home, lost without trace, or sometimes found by salvage parties weeks later, broken on the bottom of the Atlantic, still containing the remains of men who had volunteered for a service that no longer offered even the grim comfort of success. The U-boat war had transformed from a predatory business into something approaching mass suicide. German high command in Berlin issued orders that became increasingly unrealistic, demanding that boats operate in areas so well defended that reaching them alive was an achievement in itself. Orders poured through the radio to attack in the English Channel, to assault the American coast, to penetrate the inner sanctums of Allied naval power, all issued from office buildings far from the Atlantic, by men who would never feel a depth charge exploding against the hull of their boat. The emotional and psychological weight of this transformation fell most heavily on the officers commanding individual U-boats. Suhren had to lead his crew back to sea, knowing that the odds of his boat's return had contracted to somewhere between slim and non-existent. He had to look these men in the eye, men who had trained under his command, who had survived previous patrols under his leadership, and order them back into the Atlantic with the full knowledge that he was likely leading them to their deaths. The moral dimension of his choice was unavoidable. Suhren was not a man given to philosophizing about the nature of the war or his role within it. He was a naval officer, trained in obedience and devoted to his duty. Yet, even an officer of his background and conviction could not fail to recognize what had changed. In 1942 and early 1943, patrols had carried genuine danger, but they had also carried genuine possibility of success, of striking the enemy and returning to port with stories to tell and victories to record. Now, success in the narrow tactical sense, sinking a ship or two, carried so little meaning in the context of the overall war that the distinction between victory and defeat had begun to blur. U-boats were still killing ships, still sinking vessels that carried precious supplies and irreplaceable men, yet the effect on the larger strategic picture was negligible and decreasing. The D-Day invasion, when it came in the middle of June 1944, confirmed what Suhren and every thinking officer in the U-boat arm already knew. The war was lost. Not immediately, not in the sense that fighting would stop tomorrow, but lost in the sense that Germany's window for achieving anything approaching victory had closed completely. The massive amphibious assault on Normandy, the successful establishment of beachheads that the Allies had been unable to dislodge, despite desperate German resistance, the endless stream of supplies flowing across the Channel from England to sustain the invasion. All of this unfolded in an ocean where U-boats were no longer a meaningful factor. Of course, German strategy demanded that the boats attempt to interfere with the invasion logistics, to assault the cross-channel supply runs and the invasion fleet itself. Suhren and his fellow captains complied with orders to proceed to the invasion zone to attempt operations against overwhelming opposition, but the results were both predictable and tragic. U-boats dispatched to the Channel to interfere with the invasion became quick kills, and the men within them, the crews who had already endured months of increasingly dangerous patrols, were added to the mounting list of dead. Suhren's own patrols in 1944 took on a character that was almost dreamlike in its disconnection from reality. He would receive orders that seemed designed in some distant headquarters, as exercises in futility, directives to proceed to areas where Allied dominance was so complete that merely arriving alive represented a kind of victory. He would take U-564 to sea, knowing that the boat was sound, that his crew was capable, that he himself remained a dangerous opponent by any objective standard, yet knowing also that these things mattered less and less. The enemy simply had too many advantages, too many tools, too much intelligence. On one level, this freed Suhren from something that had haunted him in earlier years, the weight of his own responsibility for deaths. A captain in 1942 or 1943 bore a real responsibility for the outcomes of his patrols. His decisions, his tactics, his read of the enemy's disposition could mean the difference between success and failure, between glory and catastrophe. By 1944, this kind of responsibility had become almost academic. The fundamental parameters had shifted so completely that individual decision-making mattered only at the margins. The Allies would win the naval war because they had the resources, the intelligence, the production capacity, and the personnel to win it. No amount of courage or skill on Suren's part could alter this equation. Yet Suhren continued to do his duty, continued to take U-564 to sea, continued to hunt for targets and execute whatever missions his superiors ordered. This was not naive. It was not born of a failure to understand the situation. Rather, it was the manifestation of a code that had been instilled in him since his first days in naval training. The officer leads. The officer does not question. The officer executes his orders with precision and dedication, regardless of his personal assessment of their value. In this sense, Suhren embodied both the strength and the catastrophic weakness of the professional military officer in the service of a failing state. His competence was unquestioned. His bravery was proven. His loyalty was unshakable. Yet these very qualities, which would have served him admirably in a different context, became in 1944 the means by which he participated in a war that could no longer be won, that could only be extended and rendered more costly in human life. The daily reality of U-564's patrols in 1944 was one of tension without resolution, of danger without meaningful purpose. Days would pass with no contact, the submarine moving through waters where the constant threat of detection meant that the crew could never fully relax. The air inside the boat became thick and stale as the ventilation systems worked at reduced capacity to conserve power. The smell of diesel oil, sweat, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present stench of the bilges became so pervasive that the men ceased to notice it, except in the rare moments when they surfaced and fresh air reached them briefly before they had to seal the hatches again. The food, though as good as the German Navy could provide, became monotonous and insufficient. Men grew thin. The psychological burden of the waiting, the knowing that at any moment a distant ping might resolve into the roar of a nearby destroyer's engines, the awareness that even a well-executed maneuver might not save them, wore on the crew in ways that cannot be easily quantified. Suhren, standing in the control room with his charts and his instruments, was responsible for keeping these men alive in an environment where keeping them alive had become increasingly impossible. The moral mathematics of this situation, knowing that sending them out meant likely death, yet believing that duty required him to do so anyway, defined the existential crisis of the German naval officer in 1944. The contrast between what Suhren had achieved in 1943, the confidence and clarity that came from operating in an environment where his skill mattered, and what he faced in 1944, could not have been starker. He had proven himself capable of striking at the enemy, of commanding men in combat, of making the split-second decisions that separated survival from death in submarine warfare. Those achievements were real, yet they now belonged to a rapidly receding past. The present was one of diminishing options, of patrols that yielded nothing, of orders that seemed increasingly divorced from any coherent strategy, of men dying for causes that were no longer achievable. Suren's reputation as one of the U-boat arm's most capable captains had been earned in the previous year, but by 1944, reputation meant nothing against the overwhelming technical and numerical superiority of the Allies. The enemy's victory was no longer in doubt. The only question that remained was how long the dying would continue, and whether Suhren would be among the dead, or somehow manage to survive to see the end. Neither possibility offered much comfort. By the spring of 1944, Reinhard Suhren stood at the precipice of a war already lost. The calendar turned towards summer, and across the Atlantic, the American shipyards continued their relentless work, launching more vessels than Germany could sink in a month of desperate patrols. The strategic tide had become a tsunami, and yet Suhren remained convinced that exceptional seamanship and tactical cunning could still yield victories where the larger machinery of war had failed. U-564 lay in port after her last grueling patrol, her hull scarred by depth charges, her crew exhausted but unbowed. The boat required refitting, supplies, and repairs that took weeks in the crowded German submarine bases. But more pressingly, Suhren required a new objective, a new hunting ground, where perhaps the enemy had grown careless, where the mathematics of naval warfare might still favor the bold and the quick. The German High Command, facing disaster across multiple fronts, seized upon this hunger for action among its remaining experienced commanders. Suhren was ordered to take U-564 on an operation that embodied desperation, dressed in the language of strategic ambition, an independent raiding mission off the American coast. The logic behind such an operation, at least on paper, was seductive. The waters off the eastern seaboard of the United States had been heavily patrolled and cleared of German submarines for nearly 2 years. They had become, in the American consciousness, a safer domain than they once were. Complacency breeds vulnerability, and vulnerability had always been Suhren's prey. The voyage across the Atlantic in the spring of 1944 was no longer the deadly gauntlet it had been in earlier years, yet it remained formidable. Suhren navigated routes that avoided the heaviest concentrations of Allied escort vessels and aircraft, using intelligence reports and radio intercepts to divine the patrol patterns of enemy forces. His crew had learned to trust his decisions absolutely. They had survived encounters that should have killed them all, and they carried that knowledge like armor. The approach to American waters required patience and silence, long hours submerged during daylight, careful observation of enemy movements and timing. When U-564 finally reached the operational area off the coast, Suhren studied the shipping lanes with the intensity of a man examining a game board where the pieces moved according to the enemy's will, not his own. The merchant vessels still transited these waters, but they were fewer in number and better protected than they had been. Destroyers and frigates maintained constant vigil, their hulls cutting through the dark Atlantic with a menace that no captain could ignore. Suhren's tactical brilliance had not diminished, but the conditions under which he was forced to exercise it had become brutally constrained. He could no longer count on wolf-pack coordination, for the U-boat fleet was too dispersed and too hunted to maintain the formations that had once brought such terrible success in the Atlantic. He could no longer rely on the darkness as his sole advantage, because American escorts now carried radar that could locate a surfaced U-boat in fog or at night with appalling accuracy. He could no longer expect that merchant ships would travel in small, scattered convoys, vulnerable to a single determined attacker, because the Allies had learned their lessons and provided each convoy with multiple armed escorts and support vessels. What remained for Suhren was his intellect, his understanding of the sea, his ability to read the movements and patterns of his enemy, and his willingness to take risks that ordinary men would refuse. In late spring of 1944, he identified a merchant convoy, escorted by 3 destroyers and a corvette, moving steadily northward along the coast. The escort screen was tight, professional, and well coordinated. leaving minimal gaps through which a submarine might slip to attack. Suhren maneuvered U-564 into position with meticulous care, remaining submerged for hours, watching and calculating the exact moment when geometry and chance might align in his favor. The attack, when it came, was delivered with textbook precision. Suhren fired a spread of torpedoes from his forward tubes at ranges that gave the enemy the shortest possible reaction time. The explosions, when the warheads found their targets, were enormous, lifting a merchant vessel half out of the water in a pillar of flame and spray. The crew of that ship, most of them civilian sailors, experienced their final seconds as an overwhelming chaos of noise and heat, and the terrible cold certainty that death was upon them. Suhren watched through the periscope, fulfilling his function as a warrior, achieving his objective, and simultaneously witnessing the consequence of his action. The destroyers responded with instantaneous fury, their course changing, their sonar operators flooding the water with active pings designed to locate the submarine. Depth charges fell from their stern racks in rapid succession, sending shockwaves through the water that shook U-564 violently and rattled equipment on every shelf and locker. Suhren ordered the submarine deeper, seeking the thermal layers where sonar detection became uncertain, pushing his boat toward the edge of her design capabilities and past. The hunt continued for hours, the German crew enduring the tension of knowing that their enemies possessed superior numbers, superior firepower, and superior equipment, yet lacked the knowledge of exactly where their prey had gone. U-564 survived that encounter, limping away into deeper water, her hull strained but intact, her crew shaken but still functional. Suhren had achieved a tactical success, sinking a merchant vessel and escaping the immediate pursuit, but the victory rang hollow in the context of the larger war. More merchant ships were being built than he could sink. More escort vessels were being constructed than Germany could deploy submarines to counter, and the production advantage of the Allies was now so overwhelming that individual tactical victories had become mathematically irrelevant to the strategic outcome. Nevertheless, Suhren remained committed to the hunt. The American coast beckoned with the possibility of further attacks, and he continued his operations into summer, conducting multiple patrols and searching for targets with an intensity that suggested he either believed victory was still possible or could not conceive of any other way to conduct himself. His crew responded to his determination, maintaining the discipline and readiness that their captain demanded, executing each patrol with the professionalism that had kept them alive thus far. Yet the summer of 1944 brought changes to the Atlantic that even Suhren's tactical flexibility could not fully overcome. The Normandy landings on the 6th of June had not only opened a new theater, but had also released enormous quantities of American naval and air resources for employment in the Atlantic. Convoys began moving, with even heavier escort, and the frequency of aircraft patrols over the shipping lanes increased dramatically. Suhren encountered enemy destroyers equipped with new sonar systems that could track submarines at ranges and depths that would have been impossible just months earlier. The technology gap, always a factor in submarine warfare, had widened into a chasm, where once a skilled captain and a brave crew might compensate for inferior equipment through cunning and courage. Now the gap between German boats and Allied defenses had become too wide for brilliance alone to bridge. The patrols of late 1944 became progressively more dangerous and less productive. Suhren found targets occasionally, but establishing attack position required running closer to enemy escorts than prudence suggested, and the margin between success and disaster compressed with every new Allied defensive measure. He modified his tactics relentlessly, sometimes attempting to attack in fog, sometimes exploiting periods when escort vessels were distracted by other engagements, sometimes pursuing targets into waters so shallow that his submarine became vulnerable to collision or ramming. The willingness to take these extreme risks reflected not recklessness, but rather the logical conclusion that following conventional tactics would guarantee failure, whereas unconventional approaches offered at least the possibility of success. His crew came to understand that their captain would demand more of them and of the boat than most commanders would consider acceptable, and they accepted this as the necessary price of remaining relevant to the war effort. The weather of the Atlantic in 1944 also worked against the U-boat commander. The summer and autumn brought unpredictable conditions, sudden storms that limited visibility and complicated navigation, squalls that appeared and dispersed with little warning. These conditions also affected the enemy, but the enemy possessed resources that Suhren could not match. Additional ships to replace those damaged by weather, replacement crews trained and standing by, access to repair facilities that could replace damaged equipment within days. Suhren had none of these luxuries. When U-564 suffered damage, repairs were made at whatever base could be reached, using whatever materials were available, often resulting in solutions that were adequate rather than optimal. The cumulative effect of these limitations was that each patrol took a greater toll on the boat and crew than the patrol before it, creating a downward spiral of declining capability and increasing vulnerability. By midsummer 1944, Suhren began to recognize what his operational record and the experiences of other U-boat commanders were beginning to confirm. The offensive capability of the German submarine fleet was approaching termination. New boats were still being built, using revolutionary designs that incorporated lessons learned from 4 years of war. But these advanced submarines would not reach operational status quickly enough to change the trajectory of the conflict. The existing fleet, of which U-564 remained a part, was being hunted relentlessly by an enemy that had solved most of the technical and tactical problems that had made submarine warfare so devastating in earlier years. The wolf packs that had once brought terror to merchant sailors had been dispersed and broken. The individual U-boat captain, no matter how skilled, could no longer achieve the tonnage figures that had once made the difference between German victory and stalemate in the Atlantic. This recognition did not lead Suhren to abandon his duties or to counsel surrender. Rather, it transformed his approach to his final operational period into something approaching a rearguard action, an effort to inflict maximum damage while accepting that the overall outcome of the war was no longer subject to tactical alteration. Through the remainder of 1944, Suhren undertook operations in new operational areas, attempting to exploit what few advantages remained available to German submarines. He participated in missions that sought to disrupt Allied logistics, to attack specific high-value targets when intelligence suggested they were traveling, to maintain some form of pressure on enemy shipping, even as the cost in U-boat losses continued its terrible climb. The operations undertaken during this period were never futile in the sense that they failed to produce any results. Rather, they were futile in the sense that no amount of success could affect the broader strategic situation. A captain who sank 10 merchant ships in the summer of 1944 was sinking a tiny fraction of the ships being built in American shipyards, attacking an enemy whose production capacity had become almost incomprehensibly vast compared to German capability. This knowledge, this mathematics of defeat, weighed upon Suhren and his crew as they moved through the final months of war, still seeking victory, still hoping for success, but increasingly aware that the ocean itself seemed to have turned against them. The last great efforts of Reinhard Suhren and the U-boat fleet, of which he remained a part, were acts of defiance, conducted in the shroud of inevitable conclusion. The tactical brilliance that had once brought him recognition remained intact, but it now operated within constraints that had become, for all practical purposes, absolute. His willingness to take risks, his refusal to accept defeat even when defeat had become mathematically certain, his commitment to extracting every possible ounce of combat value from U-564 and her crew, these qualities that had made him an exceptional commander in the golden age of the Atlantic wolf packs, now served primarily to extend the conflict slightly and to ensure that he and his men would remain engaged until the very end. The summer of 1944 marked the transition of Reinhard Suhren from a commander operating within a war that might still be won through brilliant execution to a commander operating within a war that had already been lost, but from which withdrawal was not yet permitted. His story became one not of triumph, but of professional persistence in the face of circumstance, of a warrior continuing to fight because that is what warriors do, even when the battle is already decided and only the ending remains uncertain. The end, when it came for Reinhard Suhren, arrived not with the thunderous violence of his own weapons, but with the slow, methodical certainty of a superior force closing in from all directions. By the summer of 1944, the Atlantic had become a graveyard. U-564, under Suhren's command, had survived longer than most, a proof of his skill and the loyalty of his crew. But survival itself was becoming a luxury the U-boat arm could no longer afford. The Allies, now commanding absolute air superiority and equipped with detection systems that rendered the old tactics obsolete, were hunting with precision that bordered on the merciless. Suhren understood, with the clarity that comes only to those who have studied warfare as both art and science, that his window of opportunity was closing. Each patrol took longer to arrange, covered less distance, and returned with fewer successes. The tonnage sunk under his command had made him a name whispered in fear aboard Allied merchant vessels and escort ships. But names alone could not change the arithmetic of industrial war. The very reputation that had once terrified his enemies now made him a priority target. Every naval commander from Halifax to Liverpool wanted Suhren dead or captured. The final patrol of U-564 remains shrouded in the fog of conflicting accounts and lost records, as so much of the submarine war was. What is known is that U-564 did not return to her berth in occupied France. Some sources suggest she was damaged so severely by convoy escorts that Suhren made the decision to scuttle her rather than face capture. Others claim an Allied aircraft or surface vessel delivered the final blow. What cannot be disputed is that by the middle of 1944, U-564 lay on the ocean floor, and Suhren, the captain who had mastered her every system, who had willed her to success through sheer force of tactical brilliance, found himself pulled from the water, hypothermic and gasping, into the custody of men who recognized his name immediately. They knew who he was before he had finished coughing salt water from his lungs. The reputation precedes the man, and Suhren's reputation was formidable. Among Allied naval intelligence officers, his name was filed in thick dossiers, marked with priority designations. He was not just another U-boat captain, he was among the most successful, most cunning, and most ruthless. The officers who fished him from the Atlantic knew they had captured a prize. Interrogation began almost at once, in the hours after his rescue, with the soaking clothes still clinging to his body and his mind still processing the shock of surrender after years of commanding men in the frozen depths. The Americans and British maintained separate interrogation facilities, and Suhren was transferred between them multiple times, each move another layer of disorientation designed to break down resistance. The interrogators were professionals. seasoned intelligence officers who understood that Suhren possessed knowledge worth extracting, the operational procedures of the German U-boat command, the training protocols, the names of other officers and crew, tactical innovations, equipment specifications, and the details of German naval strategy in its final, desperate months. They knew that he would not yield easily. A man who had survived years of combat at sea, who had killed sailors through his orders and strategic decisions, would not crack under standard pressure. The interrogation rooms were cold and spare, lit by harsh lights that burned at night while darkness fell outside. Suhren was kept on minimal rations, sleep-deprived in the classical pattern of prisoner extraction. The interrogators took turns, adopting different personas, some aggressive and threatening, others seemingly sympathetic, offering cigarettes and warmer clothing in exchange for information. It was theater with lethal stakes, and Suhren recognized it as such. What the interrogators encountered was a man shaped entirely by the military culture he had served. Suhren did not break, not in the way they had perhaps anticipated. He answered some questions and refused others, following a discipline learned in the Kriegsmarine academies. Protect operational secrets, reveal nothing that would endanger other submarines or personnel still at sea, but do not force the interrogator to resort to extremes that might harden his own resolve or attract negative attention from higher authorities. He understood that his value lay partially in his compliance, his ability to appear cooperative while withholding the most critical information. The interrogators wanted to know about U-564's recent patrols, and he provided details that were already known to Allied intelligence through other sources: convoy positions, attack angles, crew compositions. When asked about new technologies or innovations, he became evasive, offering fragments that seemed important while obscuring the essentials. It was a subtle game, one that men trained in the duplicity of naval command could play indefinitely. The interrogators, too, recognized what was happening. They had conducted this same dance with other German officers. There was a grudging respect in the room, unspoken but present. Suhren was doing what his code demanded, and they were doing their duty as his captors. Days became weeks, and weeks became months. Suhren was moved from the immediate interrogation centers to prisoner of war camps where thousands of German soldiers, sailors, and officers were being processed and warehoused. The camps themselves were a universe unto themselves, hierarchies of rank and unit, cliques of hardened soldiers, and the constant jockeying for resources and status among men, stripped of every external marker of their former authority. Suhren, as a captain and a naval officer with an exceptional combat record, occupied a peculiar position within this world. He was respected by many of the other officers and men for his service record and his bearing, yet he was also isolated by that same distinction. Other prisoners knew who he was and what he had done. Some saw him as a symbol of German excellence and resilience. Others, particularly men from merchant marine backgrounds or those who had lost friends to U-boat attacks, regarded him with barely concealed hostility. In one camp in Canada, where several thousand German officers were interned, Suhren occupied a compound where intellectual life persisted in diminished form. Men studied, debated history and politics, and attempted to maintain the rituals of dignity even in captivity. The weight of what had transpired, what he had personally caused to transpire, seems not to have been lost on Suhren during his imprisonment. Unlike some of his fellow U-boat commanders, who rationalized their role in the war as merely following orders or serving their nation honorably, Suhren was forced to confront the human cost of his efficiency. Aboard U-564, in the moments after a successful attack on a merchant convoy, he had been focused on the tactical variables, the position of escort vessels, the next target, the fuel consumption required for the return journey, the men dying in the water, the ships sliding beneath the surface with their holds full of supplies and sometimes passengers. These were abstractions in the moment of command, necessary sacrifices in a larger struggle. Now, in captivity, with nothing but time and the company of other men who had endured similar circumstances, the abstractions began to acquire faces and names. Some of the other prisoners had been merchant sailors before the war. Some had friends who had died in U-boat attacks. Conversations about the sea war, once initiated in the camps, could become uncomfortable quickly. Suhren, from the accounts of those who knew him in the camps, neither sought nor avoided these discussions. He seemed to accept that judgment, when it came, would be rendered by history and by the survivors who emerged from the war, carrying their own weight of loss. The camps themselves were instruments of a different kind of warfare, one waged through boredom, confinement, and the slow erosion of hope. Allied policy toward German prisoners had hardened considerably by the time Suhren entered captivity. The camps were not torture chambers, but they were designed to be uncomfortable and psychologically taxing. Prisoners worked on labor details, moved between facilities, and endured the constant uncertainty of their fate and the war's outcome. News filtered in slowly and unreliably. By the time Suhren was captured, it was already clear that Germany could not win. The only questions remaining were how soon surrender would come, and what would happen to the men who had served the regime. Some prisoners fell into despair, others maintained hope, building their own routines and structures of meaning within the camp. A few attempted escape, though successful escapes from Canadian camps were rare and usually futile. Suhren seems to have adopted a stoic approach, neither resisting the camp system nor fully accommodating it. He was a captain without a ship, a combat officer reduced to the status of a detained enemy. The irony would not have been lost on him. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, as Germany's final collapse accelerated toward inevitable surrender, Suhren remained in captivity, aware of the unfolding catastrophe, but powerless to influence any aspect of it. Other U-boat commanders